Whenever you're ready,
Yep, I'm
Hugh.
good.
All right. The button
Let me know when you.
has been
Oh,
pushed.
oh, look at that. Here we go. And we're live. Hello,
Oh my
everyone.
goodness.
How's everybody doing out there today? Hope you're having a wonderful Friday. Today we're going to be chatting about a new movie called Killers of the Flower Moon. We're joined by two very special guests. One, a returning guest, John Graham. John, how you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Oh, no problem. And Theo, welcome to the channel. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, hello. Thanks for having me. Cool to be here.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, I saw that you had seen the film. Not a lot of friends I have in this sphere have seen the movie yet. So I was like, oh, joy, someone else has seen it. Hopefully they'll want to talk about it. Yes.
It is a
Hello,
bit of
everyone in chat.
a bit of a daunting task. Take a look at that runtime.
Yeah, I'm sure the whole runtime
yeah.
thing would be probably the natural place to start. But yes, today we are going to talk about Killers of the Flower Moon, Martin Scorsese's new epic 3.5 hour historical film. I'm not sure exactly what genre you would call this. Drama, I suppose. That would be nice and simple.
Crime thriller,
So
I
we'll
don't know.
crime thriller. Yeah, that's good. That works. John, what do you think?
I would lean more towards drama than thriller, but I mean, I guess both apply.
I think I'm with John on that one. The thrills are. It's not. We can
I've
talk
never
about this.
clearly understood the distinction myself, but maybe that's just me.
I think thriller is
Yeah.
a little more intense. Um,
That makes sense.
I think thrillers also tend to
Ben?
usually have some kind of like a mystery thread in a way.
Right.
right.
Anywho, so what we'll do is we're going to talk about the movie. We're going to go through it, but first, I think it would be best to start with everyone's quick take on what they think of the film. John, what did you think of Killers of the Flower Moon?
Really enjoyed it. I don't have a lot bad to say about it, really. It's just, it's not my favorite Scorsese movie, probably not even in my top three, but I thought it was well done.
What are your top three?
Yeah,
may I
just
ask?
curious, just out of curiosity.
Casino,
Yeah.
Goodfellas, Wolf of Wall Street. I think, yeah.
I've seen embarrassingly little of some of those. I have not seen Casino or Goodfellas. I own
Maybe.
Goodfellas, but I haven't watched it yet for some reason. I have it on Blu-ray because I'm like, I'll probably like this, and I just still haven't seen it. Yeah,
There's
so
a
you
weird
liked it.
thing between Casino and Goodfellas where they have a lot of overlap, like because it's a lot of this cast is similar. They're in similar roles. But I love Casino's focus on being in Las Vegas and Ace Rothstein running a casino in the 1970s where there was so little regulation. I actually like it a little better than Goodfellas, but I don't think that's the popular opinion. But whatever. But yeah,
Very
Killers of the Flower Moon. Yes, I did like it.
That's great. Theo, what did you think of the film?
I really quite liked it. I'm not like I'd want to watch it again to fully confirm that, but I guess what first viewing couldn't you say that about? So I'll just say unambiguously, I thought it was pretty damn good. I liked it a lot.
What did you like about it? Perhaps we can expand.
Gee, that's
these.
really hard to articulate, actually. Geez, the atmosphere in like really vague terms, I suppose.
Mhm.
The general mood of the film was something I found very, very engaging, and the way in which it was told, I guess, is worth mentioning. Not entirely linear in how it was presented, and I found that,
Yeah.
yeah, that kept me in it. I liked it a lot.
That's great. I suppose I'll go next. Why not? I like this movie. I have mixed feelings about it, though, and I think a lot of the things that elements I've soured on, are let's say influenced by what Hugh has told me of the book, the book that this is based on. Hugh read it. I did not, but he's told me a lot about it, and I'm sure we'll get into a lot of that as we go. But there are aspects of the story and the way it's presented, what it leaves out, what it focuses on, and the few things that it invents out of whole cloth that I struggle with. I think there's a theme to this movie about how this like telling the untold story and like implying that this story was kind of heavily brushed under the rug, that if you learn more about the book and the real life story doesn't quite hold true necessarily. So as a movie, I think it's pretty, I mean, it's incredibly well made. I think it's beautifully shot. I think the acting is really, really good across the board. Even and I know some people haven't really cared for Brendan Fraser's performance. I quite like it. Yeah, I think the acting's great across the board. I think it's probably the most beautiful movie I've seen of the year. If it doesn't win Best Cinematography, I would be disappointed. But I think there's some things to do with how they present Ernest, the main character, and how they tell the story that leaves a little something to be desired for me. It'll be interesting to talk about it as we go. And it was really, really long, but we'll talk about that too. uh, yes, in general, I liked it, but I have some mixed feelings about it. Hugh, what did you think? Killers of the Flower Moon.
Sort of the same. I didn't hate it when I came out of the theater. I thought the performances were very strong from everybody, and the cinematography is gorgeous. Martin Scorsese, I'm not a huge fan of his in general. It's kind of a, I'm not into a lot of his movies. I've seen a good portion of them, and I like them enough. I just, I don't rush out to see Martin Scorsese movies, generally speaking. I could not stand The Irishman when I tried to watch that. But this one I found much more entertaining. Uh, Although I did have some mixed feelings about certain things about it. Um, and so I decided to read the book that it is based on after I had seen it. I've only seen it the once, so I'd like to at some point revisit it after reading the book to maybe get a better feel. But I think a lot of the steps that it takes in the adaptation are a little. I'm not really sure why some of the steps that he took in the adaptation of the book were taken, and I'm excited to talk about a few of those things, because I think in some aspects they work narratively, and in others I think they kind of damage the interesting parts of the real life story. But overall, the movie itself is pretty solid, I would say. I think it's got a lot of good in there.
You mind if I ask you a question about the book quickly?
Yeah.
Uh, is it is it like is it a historical non-fiction work, or is it like a fictionalized telling of the events in the same way that the film seems to be?
So it is a historical nonfiction. Like it's written by a
Okay,
journalist for the New York Times.
gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, he's no Truman Capote, who wrote the book In Cold Blood about a famous murder from the
Hmm.
1950s. But he is a very talented writer. It's a very easy read. I highly recommend it if you like reading books, which
Yeah, I've considered checking it out. So
yeah, highly recommend it. It's very good. There are aspects of it that I found a little, because he is he's not a historian, he's a journalist. So there's some aspects of his editorializing that I
Editorial,
found
yeah.
a little frustrating at points. And not mostly as just like somebody who's kind of a general fan of history and history reading, but for the most part, it's very, very good. So, absolutely recommend
okay.
checking it out.
Right, sick.
I suppose the elephant in the room, much talked about, especially by people who haven't seen it yet, is the runtime and the lack of intermission. Um, Theo, you mentioned before we started that you had some strong opinions about the intermission aspect or the lack thereof.
I have very strong air sort of positions, if you know what I mean. In that I can see a lot of validity and arguments from both sides, right? I understand
Mhm.
not wanting your not wanting the tale that you're crafting to be like sliced open in the middle when people are going to just get up, stretch their legs, and then they're going to have to come back and try and re-engage with it. Like you're literally taking them out of it for a while. But at the same time, come on, man, it's really fucking long films. I can completely understand why people would want to, not sit still for that long. Kind of makes
Yes.
sense, you know?
Yes, I am very strongly in the camp that it should have had an intermission. I sympathize a bit with Scorsese, and I believe his editor, who said publicly that they were not happy about the fact that some theaters had decided to put an intermission of their own accord in the film. I think I don't know exactly, but there have been some theaters that have done this. I don't know where they put it. I'm very curious where they put it because I have my own thoughts about where a good place to put the intermission would be. But I do think that a film that is 3.5 hours long, the length of two movies essentially, should probably have an intermission. And I know I understand if there's not a good spot to put the intermission, it can be hard to argue that like you definitely need to have one. I do think there's a spot that would have worked in this film, like I said, and we'll talk about it. But I also know that Martin Scorsese isn't against the idea of an intermission because I mean, like I've seen lists he's made over the years of some of his favorite and most influential films. One of them that is often brought up is 2001: A Space Odyssey. I know he's a massive fan of that film, as am I. That movie has an intermission. It's only 2 hours and 20 minutes long, or like I think maybe 2.5. But I think an intermission well placed can almost enhance the engagement if it ends if it comes at a point of like maximum dramatic interest, kind of like the end of a TV show episode that makes you go, oh, I can't wait to find out what happens next. I think the idea of throwing one in haphazardly is a bad idea, and I wouldn't be surprised if some of those theaters kind of threw them in. I think one person said they kind of threw it in the middle of a scene, which is less than ideal.
Yeah,
say.
ideally
But I
you
know
want it
there's-
mid-sentence, right?
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
It's funny because
So-
a while ago when Lord of the Rings got re-released for the extended editions were being re-released for the Blu-ray releases, a theater near my house had done a screening of all three of the extended editions, like week to week. So, the first week was Fellowship, and the second week was Two Towers, and the third Return of the King. And they put the intermissions that are built into the extended editions DVDs in the theater, and it worked very well, right? Like Lord of the Rings was a long set of movies in the theater when they came out, but the extended editions having put the intermissions kind of enhanced the experience a lot, and I feel like I wish they would have had the balls to do that when they were releasing the movies theatrically at first, because a lot of those extended scenes are pretty, I would say, like they enhance more than they detract, and taking them out kind of creates some weird narrative stuff in the theatrical versions. So I don't know. I wish Marty had been a little braver in sticking with an intermission here, especially because I agree with you. There is definitely a place where one would easily have slotted in, and not like it's unheard of to do that.
It's kind of funny because just a couple of months ago, my local cinema was screening the Lord of the Rings extended editions. Ended up going to see those, same deal, like week to week, and they didn't have any intermissions in any of them.
Oh wow, that is a lot of movie.
I gave Marty some grief when I saw he made some comments talking about the length of the film. I want to get his exact words right. Here we go. Where is it? He said, people say it's 3 hours. I mean, it's 3.5, but setting that aside. People say it's 3 hours, but come on, you can sit in front of the TV and watch something for 5 hours. Also, there are many people who watch theater for 3.5 hours. There are real actors on stage. You can't get up and walk around. You give it that respect. Give cinema some respect. Now, I admire a lot about Martin Scorsese, but I thought these comments were a little dumb.
Theater
Especially
has
because
intermissions. Like that's
I would
It
I would love to give a long film respect, but my bladder says no. For the
Yeah.
last half
Yeah.
hour, I'm squirming in my chair, going, "Oh my god, I want to see the end of this," but like I really gotta piss.
You should teach your
Yeah.
bladder
So-
some respect, I guess. I don't know.
Give me a
Yeah, tell
bedpan,
your
and I will respect your cinema.
Yeah, I think that's not the feeling you want people to have physically when watching the finale of this movie. You know, the intent is to be very emotionally stark, I guess. And if people are squirming in their seats just waiting for it to end, that's probably less than ideal. I think you would do your own movie better service if you put an intermission in. And I think an intermission would help with the length of the movie. As is, there are things that when I watch them, like, you could probably cut that. You could probably cut that if you're not going to include an intermission. But if you include one, then it's not as the pacing would work a little better, I think.
Yeah. I do wonder. Well, first of all, that comparison Scorsese made, I think that's ridiculous. I mean, the obvious thing with that is that you can pause something at home, right? And get up
Yes.
and go get a drink or go to the bathroom. You can't pause a movie. I've been to some theaters where they'll pipe the audio into the bathroom, but like it's a movie. You can't see what's happening. Like you want to be there seeing what happens on screen, right?
Yeah.
So, I agree that there should have been an intermission, but the length actually didn't bother me as much as I thought it would. The only issue I had with it was that I had to pee for the last half hour, and so I was a little
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
Yeah, I felt the same way too because
It can't exactly help that.
I was expecting by
No.
the end of it to really be quite irritated with how long it was going to be. But it didn't really bug me in this one. I thought it did pretty well at the pacing. Although
Yeah,
there are some
if
issues
I-
at the end that I did have with it.
Going
Yeah.
through it on a second watch, thinking in mind, like keeping in mind, like, oh, if you could cut this down, what would you cut? There's not a lot really, unless you reformatted the story entirely from different perspectives and that sort of thing. As is, I think there's actually not a whole lot of dead weight, especially in the first half. I think it's remarkably well paced. I think it flies by, everything follows, and everything seems to take the appropriate amount of time for the material. So for a movie that's 3.5 hours long, I think even if I was being really ruthless in the edit, it probably would still be like 305, 310. You know what I mean? I think a lot of it
Right.
still really works. Before we get into the movie proper, I just want to respond to a couple super chats. Wait, there's 4 of you today. What about Dev's episode 4? I see what you did there. Dev's episode 4 is still coming. It's not a fictional creature. You will see it eventually. And just carry a piss bottle with you. That's the truest way to respect the movie outside of fasting for the day. Yeah, I like to watch a movie and have a beer, when I'm in the theater. I don't want to have to dehydrate myself all day just to make it through. So as is, it's like you're kind of either forcing audiences to squirm in their seat for the last half hour or to decide haphazardly with not a lot of information where they think the best spot to go pee in the middle of the movie is. And it's like, I don't think anything's going to happen right now, so I'm going to take my chances, which is what I did. And I think I actually didn't miss anything important, but it could have easily been. A lot of important stuff happens very briefly in this movie.
Yeah, and I skipped breakfast and drinking anything that morning just so to minimize the chance of me having to like leave. And if a movie makes me do that, like I just think that's silly. Like, and I do wonder about like, sorry, did you have other super chats that you wanted to get to? Maybe
No, those
finish
are
that off
just
first.
so far. Go for it.
Okay. Just before we move on, I think I was just thinking about intermissions and what the degree to which they are written into the screenplay, as opposed to just like thrown in after the movie's kind of edited. Did you guys see Godfather 2?
Yes, I have seen that.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
that movie has an intermission. It's right after Vito kills Don Fanucci.
Yeah.
And it's just the last shot you see is him with his 2 sons, Michael and Fredo, sort of bouncing on his lap. And then it's the intermission, and then it like fades into like it's winter now, and we're back with Michael Corleone. Like we followed Vito for a while, and now we're back following Michael. And
Yeah.
there's like a significant time jump there, and the intermission really functions on a storytelling level as like a buffer. Like
Like
even
an
if you
act break kind of thing.
Yeah.
sort of, but like
Well,
yeah,
it
like
gives you it's almost I know it's a really well placed intermission for delivering two parts of the story, and kind of it gives you some time to breathe with what's just happened with Vito, and you can kind of sit there and absorb it, and you get a little bit of the sense of like, okay, where are we going to go now with Michael as we move forward in the story with the second half. It's a really well placed, well used intermission artistically to drive the story a little. Like it gives the story a little more punch, I think.
yeah,
that,
I mean,
that
not only is it like a time jump for Michael, but it's such a pivotal moment for Vito, because once Don Fanucci's out of the picture, he's the rule of the roost now. He's basically owns the neighborhood. He's filled that power vacuum. And so it's just like, boom, he did this huge thing. Now what's next for him? And
Yes, and I think that's the perfect place to have an intermission where you leave to go pee or get a drink or whatever, and you're like, "Oh my god, I can't wait to see what happens next."
right.
The best intermission I'm aware of, that at least that I've seen, is 2001: A Space Odysseys, because it comes right when they're taking great effort to make sure that Hal can't hear them, so they turn off all the all the microphones and everything to talk about what they should do with Hal, and then you realize that it can read lips, and then it cuts to intermission. I'm like, "Oh,
Yes.
fuck."
Yeah, that's a really yeah.
That's a
I
great "oh
forgot about
shit"
that one.
moment.
That's a great one. Yeah.
I also like the way that they kind of naturally place it in the Fellowship of the Ring in the extended version when you watch it on disc. It comes right after the Council of Elrond is finished, where Pippin kind of gives the him and Merry come in and they join the Fellowship at the end, and gives the line like, "You will be the Fellowship of the Ring," and he goes, "Right. Where are we going?" And then they all just kind of look at him, and then it fades to black. It goes, "Please insert the second disc." So you get that little break right there, at like a fantastic little joke, comedy beat to just kind of take a break, stretch your legs, come back, and watch the second half of this journey. But it's at
Yeah.
it's at a good breaking point right there.
that's the thing. I don't want to assume what's going on in Martin Scorsese's head, but it feels like he's taking for granted, or like not thinking about the fact that the intermission can be like the art form can accommodate the intermission, and it can even use it in the ways that we've just been talking about. It doesn't have to be like the way he talks about it. He makes it seem like the intermission is like as was said, like mid scene, it just cuts straight to black, and then you go and wander around for a while, then you come back and it
Yeah.
cuts back on,
Yeah.
which that seems kind of a caricature way of looking at it.
Yeah, I mean, you can
Uh,
write them in and make it part of the story, I think.
Well,
Yeah.
and funnily enough, he is adapting a piece of material here that does it's written in three distinct parts, and it does have built-in intermission spots because of that. So it's not like it was an impossible task.
Yeah. I'm very
Mhm.
conflicted right now because I really want to talk about where I think the intermission would go, and I'm debating whether we should try to go through this movie chronologically or jump around. I don't know if anyone has any strong feelings about that. We are going to spoil quite a bit of the movie for anyone watching in the audience who has not seen it. So I suppose this would be your warning to go check it out on your own if you don't want any spoilers. I think we would all recommend the film for sure. Whether it's a masterpiece is probably or not is probably the main point of discussion, but we all recommend you go see it. So if you haven't, go see it. It's a good film.
Yep.
And I don't know. What do you think? Should we jump around or go chronologically? I'm really not sure with this
I'm
one.
very curious where you'd want to put the intermission, so
All right,
I
let's do
think-
it. So
I think that's an interesting, yeah. I'm not sure myself.
all right. So first time I watched it, I wasn't sure where. Like, I sympathized with them because I'm like, I don't know where you would put it, so I can understand why you thought you wouldn't want to interrupt it. Second watch, I'm like, oh, you should put it right after Rita and Bill's house blows up.
Right.
House blows up. He goes out to investigate what it was. Finds out that they're both dead, or Bill's about to be dead. I think he's yelling, "Shoot me," and stuff like that. He comes back to the house, and he tells Molly and everyone there, kind of shakes his head solemnly, and she bursts into tears, realizing that they're dead. And then we cut back to Leonardo DiCaprio with this look on his face, and then we cut to black, intermission. I think the reason that's the best spot for it is because that's the real turning point in the story. Um,
Mm.
for
Mhm.
one, it's a big, explosive, and unsubtle murder, the kind that won't be able to be shoved under the rug easily compared to all the others. And this is the final straw that forces Molly to go to Washington, which brings Jesse Plemons into the story, which is ultimately what unravels our two villainous main characters' plans. I think that's the natural, like, this is the turning point in the story. And I think after such a big, explosive, kind of the closest thing to spectacle the movie has, after a big moment like that, that's a really good time to let people go to the bathroom and go, "Oh my god, I can't wait to know like how this will affect things, where things will go from here." It also comes right around 2 hours in, so that would mean like 2 hours in the first section and 1.5 in the second, which I think is also good in terms of the pacing. Yeah, that's my suggestion. What do you guys think?
Yeah,
That's a
I'm
great
quite
point.
taken with it.
That's exactly where the book does it. Where the first part of the book ends and transitions to the second part is right at the explosion of Bill and Rita's house. So it was built in to the story. Like they kind of had that opportunity there. Chose not to take it because intermissions are, yes, I don't know.
Yeah,
Oh,
and it doesn't even have to be like in the middle or close to the middle. Like, I mean,
no.
in the Godfather 2 example, that movie is front heavy. Like the
Hmm.
second part is shorter, and that's fine
I think a
because the
lot of them are
intermissions
like
put
that.
in. Yeah,
I think a lot of
it's
intermissions do actually come something like 60% of the way through the movie, if not even a little further. I think there's some logic to the idea that like the break you get isn't exactly halfway, because then you don't have to. If it came exactly halfway, you might be like, "Oh, I have like that amount still to go." Essentially, you know what I mean? I think there's
right.
something psychological there. I think it's a big part of why movies, even movies without intermissions, like you really want to be engaged around the middle point, because like maybe the worst feeling is like, oh, I'm not even halfway through. You know what I mean? You
Yeah,
don't want
Yeah.
that feeling. So I
whatever.
think,
Whenever there's a point in the story where there's some kind of resolution to a little mini story arc, but then also there's a hook as to what's coming
yeah,
next. That's
I think that
usually the
makes for a
best
pretty
place.
good hook in terms of
Yeah,
like, well, surely they won't be able to sweep that under the rug. There's a massive explosion in the middle of a neighborhood, you know?
yeah,
And Molly is then out of family, essentially. So that
Yeah.
right.
phase of
Yeah.
things is over and done with. Yeah, it's a very good turning point.
Yes.
Well, now that we've
Yeah.
covered, the 60% mark, shall we return to the beginning?
Yeah, I
I mean, I'm
suppose.
down, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine there are people who are sticking around who have not seen the film anyway because they're masochists or whatever you would call them. Hugh, why don't you give us a little rundown of the basic premise?
So the basic idea of the movie is that there are some Native Americans in Oklahoma, and they were on some pretty shit land after being pushed around by the whites, a bit. But as it turns out, this land was chock full of oil, and so now they're rich, and they've got way more money than they know what to do with, and the whites are, circling like sharks. Is basically the premise there.
Yes, it is based on a series. Is based on a true story of a lot of, as you phrased it, shifty whites trying to get at the oil money of the members of the Osage tribe, specifically through a scheme involving head rights. So,
Yeah.
Hugh,
So
you
the
read the book.
yes.
Go ahead.
So the head writes through some pretty shrewd dealings here. So one of the things that the movie doesn't, I don't think, goes into in too much detail, is that the tribal land of the Osage at this point was being allotted, and that means it was kind of being folded into the county, divided up into squares, and essentially it was viewed as a way for white people, shiftier whites, to get their hands on the territory of the Native Americans. So the Osage tribe was one of the last tribes of Native Americans to have their tribal lands allotted, and they managed to work a little addendum into their allotment agreement that the mineral rights, and the oil and mineral rights of all their land on the reservation and the allotments would exclusively belong to members of the tribe. And at the time, nobody really, oil wasn't as big of a deal, so nobody really blinked twice at this resolution, or this little addendum in their contract. But then when it turned out that there was a fuckload of oil, like way more oil than they would have suspected underneath that land, and the price of oil boomed immediately after World War One. All of a sudden, there was a whole lot of wealth pouring in to the Native American Osage tribe, uh,
Which
and
was interestingly kind of divvied up among the tribe, evenly. Like everyone got their share of that wealth. It
the
wasn't
allotments
like
specifically. So this is one thing, like a little bit of history that doesn't really matter in the context of the narrative, but it's important to understand sort of why they were, like, where the head rights came from. The allotments, the allotment procedure had gone fucking terribly in the past with other different Native American reservations, where the allotments were basically like, whoever gets there first, whatever outsider gets there first and lays a claim on on a plot, they get to keep that land. So for days up in this, I think this happened in at some place in Kansas. For days, a bunch of people, gathered around this old reservation that was being allotted before it had official, like the clock struck midnight. And when it did, they all just like bum rushed in and started massacring each other. They trampled women who fell down. They, like, somebody would grab a plot of land and somebody would come in and just shoot him and be like, nope, mine now. So the Osage had seen that happen to other tribes, and they managed to convince the federal government that they didn't want that to happen again. So the allotments should just be divvied up amongst the members of the tribe. And the mineral rights, even if they sold the allotments, the members of the tribe, the mineral rights would never vacate the tribe, the people who had the tribal blood. So that is where that all comes.
Well, it would never vacate the head rights because
the head rights are the
because
mineral rights. The mineral rights are the head rights.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha. So what the scheme became for many people, including our two main characters, Ernest, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, and Hale. What's his first name?
Bill.
William.
William
William
Hale, also known as King, played by Robert De Niro. Their scheme becomes, well, we have to marry into these Osage families and then kill them off. That way the head rights come down to us through marriage, right? So that became the scheme. And according to the book, this is kind of, well, I think, a little glossed over by the movie. This was the scheme that many people tried, but Hale was the most.
He was the most vicious of the group.
Yes.
He was the one who committed more of these killings than anybody else in the territory. But there were a lot of people in the territory who were doing this. Like, it happened to almost everybody. So the official estimate the FBI's official estimate of the number of dead Osage during this 10-year period, pretty much, is 24. But most people believe that the real numbers are somewhere between 40 and 200 who were murdered.
You say 200?
Yes.
That's 200
is probably 200 is probably a little high, but it's definitely somewhere in the middle of that. It's I would say
Yeah.
more than likely between 80 and 150 is a more accurate number. 24
And
were the only
someone
ones that were
meant
classified as homicides. Some of them, because it was very difficult to tell, because a lot of them died of alcohol poisoning, but nobody was sure.
diabetes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And Hale was vicious while acting as the friendliest face to the
Yes.
Osage people. Like, I'm helping you
Yes.
with all these things. We're building you these buildings or whatever. These.
I speak your
He was
language.
constantly, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was
Yeah.
constantly acting like he was trying to help them. Absolutely, and he wasn't.
Yeah, well, his real life counterpart was one of the initial founders of the town that got built up around these allotments called Fairfax, and he used a lot of his wealth in cattle ranching to sort of build schools, build churches, bring trade, get doctors in. He was also a deputy sheriff, so he was sort of, the law of the region. He was very well trusted by the tribe.
Yeah. He did a very good job of endearing himself to the Osage, by offering reward money, but I mean, rather shrewdly offering reward money for any information about the murders, but they would have to come to him with that information so he can kind of be aware of what people know and keep that to himself. All sorts of stuff like that. Very clever, conniving, villainous man. So one thing that's particularly interesting about the movie is that they are the main characters. These two villains, Ernest and Hale. Not quite how the story is presented in the book. Is that right?
No, the book focuses a lot more on Jesse Plemons' character, who shows up at the right around the halfway point after the explosion at the house. It's focused more on the investigation that the FBI conducted into the murders.
Yeah, so that would be Tom White, a detective investigator for the fledgling FBI,
Yeah,
who comes in to see who's doing them. I quite like his character, by the way. I wish we had more of him.
Tom White
And,
is a very interesting character in the book. He's a real Chad, if you will.
Remind me what the full name of the book is.
Killers of the Flower Moon, The Osage Murders, and the Birth of the FBI. That's the subtitle is The Osage Murders and the Birth of the FBI, which the movie chooses not to focus on as much, I would say.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll talk about specific scenes and stuff more as we go, but I think one thing that I was less than enthused with the narrative itself is that not that it's not simply that we follow these two villains and that they're essentially the main characters, but it's like we know pretty much how evil they are from the very beginning, and we're just seeing their plan play out. So there's for me there was a kind of lack of like reveals as the story goes on. Like we weren't revealing just how monstrous they were. Really, that was pretty clear from the get-go. We're just kind of watching their plan play out. There's no mystery in terms of who's doing them because we see them doing them. That is the murders. And I think my biggest criticism of the story itself in the movie, irrespective of how it changes things from the book in real life, is that I'm confused about who Ernest is as a character, because I think the movie, how should I say it? I think the movie is unsure exactly how evil Ernest is. They show him doing like horribly evil things, but then also there are aspects that make me think that they're trying to paint him as something of a tragic figure who actually did love his wife, when I don't really believe that based on other things that he did. I don't know how you guys felt about his story being the central focus or not, but there was something missing in that I felt, when I learned more about how it's presented in the book, it feels like a more compelling story might have been one that follows either Molly more deliberately or Tom White, the Jesse Plemons character.
I do remember hearing that Ernest got quite the glow up in terms of his presentation as compared to like the actual history of things, or as compared to maybe the book's depiction. I'm unsure how I feel about it because I think it's a vaguely interesting narrative wrinkle because like I'd say the core trait of Ernest is that he's really fucking stupid and gullible, right? Does seem
Maybe.
reasonable.
We
I
could
think
probably say that he's very malleable in his uncle's hands, I would say. Like he's kind of like putty in his uncle's hands. And I think the movie is very clear at spelling out that he is greedy, and that's sort of his motivation. Like he said,
Yeah.
that's one of the first things he says
He's
about
very
himself
greedy.
is that I'm greedy, which it's a little it's a little complicated.
The only
Because
pushback I would give to the idea that he's primarily kind of stupid or gullible is that I think there's kind of three ways of looking at why he does what he does in this. One is that he's just kind of ruthlessly greedy and evil and uncaring and callous and all that sort of stuff. Two is that he's kind of stupid and easily manipulatable by Hale, especially. And he kind of ping pongs back and forth between different people's influences because he's really malleable. Or three, that, and this is not something that's explored in the movie, but it seems to be presented based on what Hughes told me more clearly in the book, is that he's truly very, very afraid of Hale. We get a little bit of that in the movie, but not as much apparently as it was presented in the book.
yeah, well, I was
So
gonna say that in the way that they present the interviews with him in the book, it kind of shows that he was very like he's really scared of what will happen to him if he doesn't listen to his uncle. And that
in a self-serving way, or is that what you mean?
he thinks that if he doesn't do what his uncle tells him, he's going to be killed, basically, because he knows what his uncle does, right?
Is
Like
capable of, yeah.
what his uncle
Right.
is capable of. And so he goes along with a lot of the plans because of that. He's more afraid. He doesn't love his wife as much as he is afraid of Hale and what Hale is capable of, and what can happen either to his. I mean, you could read it as to his wife and children and to him, or you could read it as just to him. It's a little. It's an interesting topic, an interesting character trait. I wish they had explored a bit more in the film, because I think that he in real life was a little more complex than the movie presents him. Even though he is a complex character in the movie, it's just that
Uh, yeah, one thing I want to add just to bolster what Theo mentioned about his glow up or slightly more flattering portrayal. And Hugh, tell me if I get any of this wrong, but in real life, it was revealed that originally the plan was to send Molly and his kids over to stay with Bill and Rita on the night that they planned to blow the house up. And that the only reason they didn't was not because he said, no, don't go tonight because, because you'll get killed, is that someone got a cold or something like that. So they stayed home.
yeah, his son
right?
had bad earaches, and his son
Yeah.
didn't want to go, so Molly canceled the plans to go over. But she had basically had told him, "Oh, we're going to go stay at Bill and Rita's tonight." They're nervous that something might happen because they'd been targeted and they were being stalked. And so she was like, "Well, they want other people in the house, so we're going to go stay with them." And
And he didn't try
he
to
did
stop
not
her,
try to stop her. He just kind
knowing
of
full well that this was going to be the night that they blew up the house.
he was very well
which-
aware that that was going to happen that night.
So, and if that had happened, if she had died in that fire, then the head rights would have gone to him by default right away.
Yes.
And so that tells me that he truly, really didn't care about his wife and children dying all that much. So that kind of paints him as much more evil. I feel like what the movie tries to do is present it like he was fine for whatever reason, either because he was scared of Hale or gullible or just an awful person, with killing off or being complicit in the killing off of Molly's entire family, but that he didn't want to kill Molly himself, and that would have been like too far for him because secretly he really did love her. Which, based on the book and even based on some of the things that happened in the story, I don't believe for a second that he really loved her. So I was a bit confused by that portrayal of him, or
I
what the
would
movie thinks it's saying about him.
I would really love to know how he squares like his feelings of love towards her with the things that he does to her family. Like, I know that there's Bill in the whole affair, which is something of a wrench in the works, but it just seems like pretty irreconcilable, even though, like, people's emotions aren't necessarily logical in that way. But I don't know how you can feel that strongly towards someone while killing their entire family.
Yes,
Yeah,
that's my big problem with trying to understand who he's supposed to be in the movie, and I think it's because, from what I understand of the book, that he didn't actually really love her like that,
Yeah,
or
that's what I've heard.
that it was, and so I think ch- portraying him as something of an tragic isn't quite the right word, but there's a little twinge of that he's almost like a tragic figure caught between greed and his love for his wife in this movie, and I'm like, I don't think that's true.
I
I
think it
don't believe
was.
that.
I think it was like the writer's attempt to make him more complex, right? To add some drama to the story. If I was to guess as to why that decision was made.
well, that could be. That's definitely a part of it. However, so okay, one of the I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit because this is kind of an
We're
important.
gonna
Like,
jump around.
this
That's
is
totally
important
fine.
to the context of this particular character moment. It is true that upon finding out that his youngest daughter had died of a disease while he was, in jail awaiting trial for these murders, he he did have a massive change or like crisis of conscience, which caused him to change his. He basically decided that he was going to testify against his uncle because he viewed the death of his daughter as a punishment from God for what he had done. And so he began to try to make right in a way afterward. And even after he was paroled eventually, he got a life sentence and was paroled. He tried to come back to Oklahoma in order to be near his surviving children because, well, there's no real reason given in the book, but you can maybe read into it that it was because he felt guilty in some way. So
I'd imagine so, yeah.
yeah, so the problem with the story of him potentially just sort of by omission allowing his wife and children to die in the explosion is that number one, it comes from a rumor that was told by the by the granddaughter of Ernest to the author of the book. So she says that, oh, well, yeah, my dad always said that we were supposed to go stay over that night, and the only reason that we didn't was because of my earaches. Now, why that man would lie about that is like, there's no real reason for it. He might be misremembering something, but it seems like a strange, like, if you're trying, I think if you're adapting it and trying to make Ernest the main character of the film, you definitely would want to leave that little bit out, right? Because it kind of conflicts
Probably.
with the story. Well, it really conflicts with where he ends up and where the trial ends up. Because like it just, if the audience knows that and then sees him react this way to finding out that his daughter died, even though he was willing to let them blow up in a massive explosion, there's going to be a little bit of a problem there. So I think it's a little bit of both. It's an adaptation that tries to make him a little more of a tragic hero by erasing some of the facts, a couple of details from the family, but also if he does seem like, I mean, he was an evil person, a truly evil person in real life.
Yeah,
And that's one of the reasons
it's
why I think the
complicated.
author of the book doesn't use him as the main character.
It's
Feels like
messy. for sure. Go ahead,
Yeah.
Theo.
Yeah, people are messy. It feels like in many ways you sort of have to square away, like not completely in terms of blame, but you have to square away some of his behavior as just the presence of Bill like lurking over his shoulder. The man
Hmm.
clearly had a lot of sway over him, and as you said, he was probably in real life he was afraid of him, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think if they played up that, I think what it comes down to for me is that based on solely on what's in this movie, I don't feel like that I don't feel that I walked away from the movie understanding him. And I feel like that should be the goal of making him the main character in a story like this, to try to understand how someone could do all these things. And I felt from whatever, limited life experience I have, that I don't believe him as a real person as he's as he's presented in this, or at least that I don't believe he actually loved his wife. I don't know if he was just deluding himself into the fact that he did, or and I think there are some things like focusing more on just how afraid of Hale he was that might have helped that. Either way, I felt a disconnect from the protagonist of the film.
I think I have a little
And
bit of a different take on this. Not a lot, because you've made a lot of good points here, all of you. And um especially what you just said there, Capital, about like him convincing himself that he's in love with Molly out of pure fear of his uncle. That's interesting. Like he's so afraid of him. But, but like I think there is a little bit of him that does love Molly, and I think the film is better for it because it then becomes a story about the greed in everybody, even good people, because like everybody can be at least a little bit selfish, I think. But if in the movie he was just an objectively bad character who did nothing but bad things, then it's just like, oh yeah, well of course he's greedy. He's just bad, right? What I like to think of it is like he loved Molly to a degree, but he loved money more in the end, and that's sort
yeah,
of like where it kind of thematically comes together for me.
I do think that's what they were going for.
Yeah.
Um, I think I think to echo what Theo was saying, I would really like to know how he squares away his love for Molly with murdering her whole family, because that's something
Yes.
that I just can't wrap my head around.
Well,
And I
I think
think
it was Theo that said he loved her, but not in that way where like you're willing to look after somebody's family. But I think he loved Molly as an individual, like for selfish reasons, and then he considered her family just ancillary, like expendable, like
I
whatever.
maybe I'm just quibbling here, but like that doesn't feel like love at all to me. You know,
Sure.
I think I can't square those two things away in my head. I
Okay.
think the way I make sense of the movie as it is that he kind of like deluded himself into thinking he loves Molly.
I think we can square things away somewhat in that way, and I think his decision to lie to her right at the end sort of supports that. He strikes me very much in the way he acts in all of his scenes as a very like emotionally stunted and emotionally like unaware individual that he doesn't like
Hmm.
not necessarily like a psychopath or probably a psychopath, but it's something to that effect where he doesn't properly process like other people have thoughts and feelings around him other than like Bill, who he's terrified of.
Yeah.
The reason I say he
Um,
loved Molly for selfish reasons is that he wants to settle down with somebody and just
Yeah.
have a wife, right? And then it's like, well, I don't
mhm.
interact with the family, so I don't care about them. But like there's a scene early on that's throwing me off where I'm starting to rethink now based on what you guys have said here, where it's just before they get married and Leo's or Ernest is saying to his uncle, like, I really love this girl. Like I picked up on some sincerity there, at least a little bit. I don't think it was all bullshit, but maybe it was because again, maybe that was just out of pure fear of his uncle. He's trying to convince his uncle that he's actually in love with this girl, and like there's sort of a wink wink thing going on between the two of them there where it's like we both know this is bullshit, but yeah, you're saying you
I
love this
detect the
girl.
same I detect the same sincerity that you're talking about, and I think what the movie presents, at least at times, is that he was like okay with the plan to get rid of the family, and he thought that once the family was gone, she would just live out in old age and she would eventually die and he would get all that money. Like I think maybe the stupidity or gullible angle is that like he didn't think that Molly would be a target in the way that she was for
Yeah,
Hale.
because they don't live long.
Yeah, and he made
Yeah.
Hale did say that quite a bit. Like she's gonna die anyway.
Yeah, they're
we
sickly
might as
people.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think his portrayal in the movie is mostly bad because there's like an underhanded yet telegraphed, um, sinister element to all like the planning. Like, there's a scene where the uncle's talking with Ernest, and they're on the porch, and they're just looking at all the sisters as they're walking by. And it's almost like a hit list, basically, where it's just
Yeah,
like, we're going to kill
yes.
her, we're going to kill her, she's got to go. But like the dialogue they're exchanging is all kind of bullshit, where it's just like, ideally, you want these people to live forever, but shit happens. So it's kind of funny in a way, where it's just like, why would you even say live forever? Like that feels like you're leaning too hard into trying not to seem like a killer at this point,
Yeah, I think maybe. Go ahead.
I was just going to say the last thing I'd want to mention with regards to Ernest as well, and his feelings towards Molly is just good old fashioned racism. The
Yeah.
fact that he may very well just not see her on the same level, like he doesn't see her as the same way he might have seen his wife if she was white. Let's say,
Well, and that's a good point, because in the historical record, a lot of people in Oklahoma, they were, in fact, one of the reasons why the investigative team and the prosecution team tried so hard to get the case against Hale and Ernest tried at the federal level, was because they were worried that there was no way a jury of Oklahomans would ever convict white people for killing Native Americans, regardless of how systematic and brutal and just completely ugly it was. They could present any of the evidence they had, but they were really scared. Now, they were scared of that, and also of the fact that there was the corruption angle at the local government plays a much bigger role in the book, and so in real life, than it did in the movie. But
in terms of Hale kind of functioning like a mob boss who's bought off, jurors and the judge and things like that.
Yeah,
Those are hinted at in the movie.
Yeah,
but they're made much more explicit.
It's
like
far more.
Brendan Fraser's
one of the jurors was threatened at gunpoint by Brendan Fraser's character, the attorney, during like a voir dire, or he showed up at a witness's house and demanded that he not testify. And when the guy said, "What if I do?" he said, "Then I'll kill you right here," and acted like he had a gun in his pocket. And the guy wasn't sure if it was real or not, but he ended up, backing out of his testimony. So there's a lot of that played a much heavier role, which
that and the racism,
absolutely
played a like a smaller role in the story than I would have thought. There's like one scene in particular that comes to mind where there's two older characters that are talking about two of the like biracial, I guess you'd say, children. Like, oh, that one's darker than the other, and they're being very openly racist. But for a lot of the rest of the movie, except for maybe implied in how they treat them, that is like implied in how Hale acts around them, there's not as much open racism as I would have expected in the story. But really quick, before we continue, I just want to acknowledge a super chat from Boren. It says, "Cheers, everyone. Shut up, Theo." So,
damn,
get fucked, Theo.
Yeah,
all right, my bad, I guess.
Just getting back to Ernest. I think there's just a lot of questions I have about how he, like you said, how he squares those things away. I don't think he's impossible as a character. I don't think it's impossible for someone like him to exist. But I feel like I want more, especially if he's the main character. I would have preferred a story that focuses either more on Molly or Tom White. the FBI detective for different reasons. But if we're going to focus on Ernest, I wanna come away understanding someone like him, and I felt like there's something missing there. I
Well,
understood Hale pretty well.
one of the things you said threw me off about the explosion. About maybe I'm misunderstanding. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought in the explosion, Molly's life was at risk. But
So
like she
yeah,
was with him,
so
and the explosion was a different house,
so
right?
what was
So
supposed to
according,
happen, according to the granddaughter of Ernest Burkhart, her father was his son, Cowboy, the one with the earaches. He he had always told her that Molly and the children of Ernest were supposed to be in the house that night because Molly had been planning on staying over at the house that would eventually explode. And Ernest knew that it was going to explode that night because he was the one who had, given the order basically. And he did not try to stop them. The only reason that they ended up not going was because Cowboy had a bad earache, and so Molly called Bill and Rita and said, "Oh, we're not coming."
Oh, okay. Was that in the
so
movie, not just the
No,
book?
I
no,
don't believe. I think they cut that out of the adaptation.
Okay.
either in an attempt to try and make his character slightly more sympathetic, or because the writer of this movie or director doesn't believe that story. Either
That is,
one.
yeah.
I'm
Either one
happy
is
to.
possible. Um,
Yeah, it was just part
Right.
of part of the discussion about how he's portrayed in the book versus how he's portrayed here. One
Sure.
note on that subject, something that was invented for the movie entirely is that Ernest killed that PI himself. That
Right.
didn't happen at all,
as far
apparently.
as I'm aware, when I was going
He
through,
was alive, right?
that PI, oh, the one who they
He didn't. Yeah, he wasn't killed.
he wasn't even that PI never
Yeah.
even showed up. That guy was not ever actually in the town. There was a team of them who were investigating, and they were being managed by the guy who managed Molly's estate. And so he kind of deliberately sort of, misappropriated funds in order to make sure that they didn't have what they needed to investigate any further. But none of them, as far as I'm aware, were ever killed while they were on the investigation.
I did I did like a tiny bit of reading. I read that he was like beaten and like told to stay away, essentially. Is that me just making shit up?
That is not anywhere in the book.
Yeah, maybe I'm just misremembering what I read. Either way, yeah,
It's an
doesn't change the point.
interesting. It's an interesting. It's an interesting thing to add because otherwise, Ernest never directly killed anybody. But because they show, and it seems, unless this was evidence somewhere else, not in the book, and he actually did kill a PI with his own hands. Inventing that for the film is an interesting choice. I don't know what to make of it. It almost seems like there are some things that they omitted for the sake of making him look a little better or making him more complex, at least. And there are some things like this that they invented that just make him look worse that maybe he didn't even do. I think I think it'd be easier for me to swallow that he has somehow convinced himself that he's not as complicit in this as he actually is if he never actually killed anyone himself and he was just doing things. He was just obeying orders, from the top
Mm.
down.
That
But
seems to be the
because
case. Is that in real life he was kind of just obeying and distributing orders from the boss. He wasn't
so yeah,
hands on.
he's obviously still complicit in that case, and that raises a whole bunch of questions about how he can claim to love his wife still. But I think it'd be a little bit more believable how he could compartmentalize those things. He's like, "Oh, I'm not actually doing any of this myself. I'm just being an intermediary between Hale and the people who are actually doing the killings." But they invent for the movie that he kills the PI who was there to help solve the murders. Kind of throws a wrench in things a little bit. I'm not sure why that was included. I think that might have been a bad choice.
Well, given your stance on that, and I don't mean to jump far ahead here, but like because you brought that up, I'm wondering what you make of him taking the poison that was put in with the insulin as sort of a form of self-punishment. Do you think
Oh,
that's
when he
any
takes it
indication
himself.
about what he might have actually cared about? Like,
I think how I read that is he wanted to see what it did,
see,
in a sense.
that was actually my first interpretation. Because I thought I misunderstood it. Like when I first saw it, I thought he really wasn't sure what he was putting in with the insulin, and then he
Mhm.
started taking it himself just to see, like, I'll see if I get sick the next morning. But
Yeah.
then I sort of had a new understanding of it later on when I did a bit of reading, where it's just like he knew what we strongly suspected this was going to be poison. And then by the time he was taking it himself, he knew it was poison as a way of deliberately punishing himself
So
because he knew he was doing something
I
wrong.
do have
I think it
a
can be
take on
both.
this one,
Yeah.
because that was never revealed during the investigation, and as far as anybody who was involved can tell from what I remember from the book, he was either had convinced himself that it was real insulin or was unaware that it was being poisoned before he gave it to her. So the deliberate choice to make him aware of what was going into the insulin is another thing that was added for the sake of the film. And it does.
Including her, like, grilling him on it at the end of the movie.
Yeah, that didn't happen. So as soon as it came out what he had been complicit in, she basically just immediately filed for divorce and stayed away from him for the rest of her
That
life.
is the murders themselves, because one problem I have, and we'll talk about this more in detail, is I don't quite like the final scene with, Lily Gladstone's Molly, where she seems seems more focused on the poisoning than the murder of her family. But we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Yeah, but
Um,
I find so
the
my
point.
take on the poison. Sorry to step on you there, but
Oh, you're fine.
my take on the poison. I I don't particularly like that they made it explicit that he knew what he was doing. Now, it's hard for me to believe that this guy who knew what his uncle was doing, who knew basically what every other shifty white spouse of every other Osage, head right holder in this town, they were all doing this. One of the things that comes up pretty frequently, particularly towards the end of the book, is that so many of these people were killed by, they died officially of alcohol poisoning, and so their deaths weren't ruled a homicide, but most of them either didn't. Prohibition was happening during this time, and while it was easier to get alcohol in this sort of lawless area that had just been incorporated as a state, it was it wasn't as common really as the movie makes it seem like it was. They don't even. I don't believe there's even really a mention of prohibition once in the film, which is an interesting choice as well to kind of sidestep that was happening.
Kind of implied, but not made super
Mhm.
explicit.
Yeah, and
Um,
that one of the implications of that is that because prohibition was active pretty much everywhere, and Oklahoma had such a small a small group of authority figures in a very loose authority structure, a lot of these shifty people flooded to Oklahoma as sort of like the last bastion of a place where they could just sort of ply their devious trade by themselves, so
yeah.
and under the
Right.
radar.
I wanna get back to
Yeah,
the idea of
I just want to like
poisoning
I'll
because
yeah. So a lot of the poisoning was like he. It's hard for me to believe that the real guy wouldn't have at least suspected, given how much worse his wife was getting, that this insulin was being poisoned. But making it explicit is a it's very difficult for me, especially given that he does end up sort of seeking a redemption by the end when his child dies and he
Well, I
goes
don't.
to.
I'm gonna.
It's just
I'm
I
gonna
don't know.
disagree with you because I don't have a problem with the poisoning in the narrative. I think my interpretation is very similar to John's in that it's kind of a combination of both things. At first, they're telling him. I think it's reasonable from his perspective to think that the insulin is being like uh, combined with
Tampered
some
with,
sort of
yeah.
sedative thing, sedative rather than poison. In that they're just trying to slow her down, is the way it's framed. So, for context, in the story, this is getting to the point where Molly's taking things into her own hands, and she's going all the way to Washington to try and get the federal government to help investigate these murders. And Hale is worried about that, so he starts the insulin that we're giving her for her diabetes to make sure she lived longer than the other sisters to ensure that the head right falls to her, is now being we find out that it's being poisoned, right? But they tell him, Ernest, that is, that they're just trying to slow her down. And I can reasonably, I mean, he's gullible, and I think he's probably deluding himself a bit. But I think when they first start that process, I think it's reasonable to think that Ernest is just like, oh, this is just something that's gonna like slow her down so she can rest and recuperate. Like that it's more of a sedative than poison. But I think he gets to the point where kind of because he wants to know exactly what they're doing to her, he tries it on himself and also as a sort of like punishing himself for his own wrongdoing. He sort of takes some himself, and that's especially towards the end when he's really in a bad way about everything falling apart around him.
That's fair. You know
So
what?
I
That's
think
fair.
I think
You know
I
what?
think it's fine.
I'm
I think it's
convinced.
fine as a narrative as a narrative device in the story. I think it actually works fairly well. My big asterisk to that would be that it's focused on more for Molly than it is the murder of her family in that final confrontation.
Okay, yeah.
So
So if we want to, sorry, go ahead.
So I just want to add one more thing to that. I totally agree with the deliberate ambiguity there. Like you want to sort of make the audience a little bit unsure. But I think at that point in the story, Ernest's character knows more than he's letting on. Because all these family members of Molly's have died at this point. And then like they have this exchange in that scene where like there's the insulin and then this unknown chemical component where it's just like this will
Chemical
slow her
X,
down,
yeah.
and he's just like he's nodding, he's like, yep, slow her down, yep, slow her down, yep, okay.
He's
And
nodding
they
along
just
like
like
he wants to believe it, you know?
yeah, that beat
Yeah.
lasts a little too long for me, where it's just like you at least kind of know what this probably is, but you're just
Yeah.
thinking, I'm gonna believe that this isn't poison, and I'm just gonna go along with this. But and then eventually
so
he's
hard
just
for
like,
me to
this isn't
understand him.
poison. This is poison, isn't it? Because she's not getting better, she's getting worse. And then at that
Yeah.
point, he starts taking it himself to punish himself. That's
Yeah,
my
it's
my
it's a
thoughts.
strange mix of gullibility, if that's a word, and like willful delusion on his part. But there are some things like I don't know how you've managed to convince yourself of any
Yeah.
of a lot of this stuff. But that's in general Ernest's arc. He right away from the get-go is on board with the plan that Hale proposes to off the members of Molly's family in the correct order and marry Molly. That way the head rights fall to her. And then things start to unravel when the investigators finally show up after a few mistakes are made in the plan along the way. And then
There's a couple tiny ones, you know,
a couple tiny
little
ones.
bits.
Yeah, we could talk about some of those. I was just sort of outlining his arc, if you can call it that. By the end, you know, when they get caught, then it becomes whether he's going to testify against Hale, and he flip flops again here too. Some ways I find believable. Some make me question whether he's actually quite dim-witted or whether he's delusional. I'm a little confused about, but ultimately he does what I guess you could call is the right thing, and testifies against Hale. And in real life, though this isn't really focused on, since we kind of blow past the trial at the end of the movie, he will eventually be convicted himself for being complicit. I think, especially in remind me, is it Rita and Bill's
Yeah, Rita
death that
yeah,
yeah.
he's given a life sentence for that one more specifically. Hale is convicted for life on a couple. The main one is the murder of Henry Rohn, the guy who running the insurance scam on. He's insuring him for
Yeah.
$25,000, and then
So that is
yeah,
a friend of Hale's, like someone who works for him and apparently owes him a lot of money. Hale has devised this scheme to get an insurance policy out on him, so that way, when he eventually dies, he can that he can pay back his debts in in death, essentially. And so there is a lot with Hale trying to make sure he doesn't die too soon and to make sure that he gets the money that's coming to him while simultaneously pretending that's his best friend and all of that sort of stuff. Hale, I think, is a much more understandable and dare I say believable character than Ernest. Not that I would want Hale to be the main character, but he's just kind of classic villain. I really like him. I think Robert De Niro does an
he
especially
really
good
knocked it
job
out of the park
portraying him.
in this one.
Oh yeah, he's very. I think when Robert De Niro is trying, like actually putting in the effort, he's like one of the better actors out there. There's been a lot of movies he's been in the past, I don't know, 20 years or so, where it seems like he doesn't really try, but he tries for Martin Scorsese movies, and I appreciate that. He's quite funny in this in a very darkly comedic sort of way.
You didn't like
Really
Dirty
like.
Grandpa?
Is
Sorry.
that cinema? I
That's-
haven't.
It gets a 4 cinemas out of 8, I believe.
He's the mastermind of all of this, for obvious reasons.
Yes.
There's only a couple problems I have with his character and what he does. One of them, I think, might be it's a small scene and it looks incredible, but it might be actually like the worst scene in the movie, just in terms of like the coincidence of what happens here. So when Jesse Plemons and his gang of investigators come to town to finally start trying to piece together who's killing all these people and bring them to justice, they have a little meeting in a field where they're describing what they've learned so far. And then they look over and they see Hale is burning his estate for fire insurance money, which is just a wonderful coincidence that they just happen to be there for. And also rather stupid of Hale to do that while he's being investigated by the FBI. And then it turns out that didn't happen at all.
Well, so it did happen. He did burn his estate.
I know. I was just about to say that he decided to burn his estate as a smoke screen, as a way of indicating that he's being targeted as well, not for fire insurance money. And I think the idea of like his estate getting burned to be like, look, I'm the target of this violence as well as a member of this community who stands by the Osage. I think that's a much better motivation for doing that than burning his place for fire insurance money when he's being investigated for all
A
these
brazen
other crimes.
display of just bold, piling mistakes on top of each other by doing it when he knows the investigators are literally in town looking at him, and
they just happen to be right there actually at the exact time to see it. That part,
agree. Yeah, that's
it was a little silly, but it looks great.
It is a really good incredible scene. It's a very
oh yeah. The way they shoot the fire is particularly impressive. You can really see the heat. Yeah, I think this movie it should win Best Cinematography. I'll be pretty disappointed if it doesn't. Fun fact: the cinematographer of this movie also shot Barbie, so he's got some range.
Wow.
Otherwise, I think Hale is a very compelling and believable and well acted character, well written character. I think he really. He's a big part of what works about this movie. I suppose since we've already sort of started talking about characters and their stories in this, the next place to start would probably be Molly. Molly is one of the central characters in the movie, but she's definitely not the protagonist. The protagonist is definitely Ernest. Now, I've seen some people lament or complain that Molly wasn't the protagonist in the film. But I think there's something tricky about trying to make her the main character because she knows so little of what's happening until the very, 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 very end. Because in real life, she believed Ernest when he said like, "Oh, this is all a mistake. I'm just, I didn't do this at all. I'm just being arrested." And so she doesn't really learn the full extent of what's happening until the trial. So it would be a little I don't, maybe not impossible, but very tricky make her the point of view character.
He also
But
spends so much of it in poor health, right? So
Yes.
yeah,
Sick in bed, delusional. I mean, this movie, I think part of what frustrates me about this is that like Ernest is definitely the main character, but the movie does have the flexibility and a sort of omniscient view of things to show things that Ernest doesn't see and to show things from other characters' perspective, such that like we could have had more to do with the investigators if they really wanted to. I suppose now might be a good time to bring up something I saw on Twitter today. This is Lily Gladstone, the actress who plays Molly, talking about I'll just read what it says. Variety, Lily Gladstone on why it's best that Killers of the Flower Moon didn't focus on a criminal investigation. Quote, how unfortunate it would have been for audiences to walk away under the impression that the FBI are the saviors of Native women. Now, I I find that attitude very telling in terms of how this story was presented because what literally did happen is that the FBI literally did save her character. Like that is what
Yeah, that
happened in
that's
the
how
story.
the real history shook out. She
Now, and
her real
I
character, even more insulting, that her real character believed wholeheartedly that the Federal Bureau of Investigation were going to be the only ones who would be able to solve
yes,
these
because
murders.
Hale didn't have his hands in the,
yeah.
Yeah.
corrupting everything. I think there's a sort of attitude that this movie has, and I think it's part of the reason that it focused so much on Ernest when that's not how the book tells things. Is that there's this they want to avoid telling the story of heroic or at least upstanding FBI agents coming in to try and solve the case, um, because they want a sort of reckoning with the sins of the past. And in trying to make that the main narrative, they've missed out on what might be a slightly more compelling narrative from the investigator's point of view, like a mystery to be solved. That's not how they had to do it, but I think that would have been more interesting to me. I'll say that, and I think focusing on the evil and less on the good kind of implies like there wasn't. Uh, I don't know. I don't like this idea that we need to not tell the whole story because we want to avoid being criticized for white savior tropes. Like,
right.
well, there were FBI agents that came in who literally did save this character and did seem like really good people just trying to do their best to bring these characters to justice. I don't like the idea of
If
only
I
telling half
may
the story.
interject here, on behalf of Jesse Plemons' character Tom White, this man was an absolute giga chad in the realm of investigators, especially at this era. He was a former Texas Ranger. They definitely bring that up at one point in the film, but he was very dedicated to never discharging his firearm if it could be prevented. He always tried to give people the benefit of the doubt. And after this case was closed, he ended up going and becoming a warden of one of the biggest penitentiaries in the country at the time, which is the same penitentiary where Bill Hale is eventually incarcerated. And when Bill Hale showed up, he came outside to greet him and shook his hand and brought him in. At one point, a group of people used him as a hostage to escape from the prison, and they got him into a bus. They drove out into the middle of Kansas somewhere and happened upon a farm, a barn where a young girl and her brother were, and they took them as hostages too. The girl basically got a chance to flee, and Jesse Plemons' character grabbed one of the escaped convict's weapons and pointed it at himself, took the shot, and survived, and went back to work. And like one of the guys who got recaptured and brought back to the prison, he basically just was like, no hard feelings, let's just keep working on you. And so he basically forgave him, maybe not forgot. But he was basically just a really, really good guy who believed in justice and the letter of the law. And, a little bit on, behalf of him, her kind of taking him to task on that quote is a little, it's just a little bit hurtful, I would say. I mean, he probably wouldn't feel that way because he was just a really good dude who understood pretty much everything. He seems like,
I mean, I think the broad point being that like he's a big part of the story. I mean, it's a big part of the title of the book is the birth of the FBI and how the federal government came in to try and get to get a handle on the corruption and everything awful that was happening at the local and state level. And that they had, I think he's something of a heroic character in the real story, and the idea, and he actually did save her life because she would have died.
yeah,
Like,
well,
absolutely, she would have
a
died.
very heroic,
But-
a very
but,
heroic man. Sorry, Theo.
No. I was just agreeing. Yeah, she was dead to rights, essentially. She was being poisoned.
And I think I would not be surprised at all if Lily Gladstone's idea that, like, I'm glad they didn't focus on the investigation because we don't want to play into the white savior trope. It's like, well, there's plenty of, you don't have to portray them as absolute, like, pure, perfect heroes who are just doing this out of, the good of their hearts and that, like, they saved the Native Americans. Because at the end of the story, there's a lot of gut punches left to the effect of, like, how they got out of prison and how these murders continued and stuff like that you could have included. I think you can tell the story honestly, including the heroism, without doing any injustice to the story of Native Americans. And I don't like this idea at all.
Well, I think the book
I really
did that
don't.
very well. I think the book managed to do that and tell a good story about a good man who did his best, and it wasn't quite enough. The murders continued despite the conviction that his investigation got. And he died in relative obscurity because he wasn't a big star figure or anything like that. He wasn't comfortable in the spotlight kind of thing. So it's not like he was a very well-known person. It's not like he didn't, he wasn't.
He also didn't need to be the only main character. We could have done something like where we followed Ernest and Hale from the beginning, and then there's kind of a switch in point of view at the middle. Or we could have tried to follow, I don't know. There's more we could have done, I think, that would have been slightly more interesting. But I do feel like his role in the story was downplayed, and I wouldn't be surprised at all that was the general attitude amongst the filmmakers, the writers, to try and do justice to the injustice and then kind of minimize the good, if that makes any sense. I don't know what you guys make of it.
No, it does. If I may, here, like to
Okay.
just add to what you were saying, I totally agree. I mean, regarding the Lily Gladstone quote, like I kind of understand the thought process. I don't agree with it, but like I get like you're making a movie about like, oh, this the Osage people were targeted by white people, and who saved us? Another bunch of white people. Like she doesn't want to like do that, but like she does that without coming to the conclusion that like maybe it's not actually about race. Maybe it's just about like in regard to the Bureau of Investigation. Maybe it's just about individuals coming together and trying to bring justice to a world where there's so much injustice. I mean, one of the feds in the movie is an undercover Osage or Native American. I don't know if he's Osage.
Yeah.
He
He was kind of
yeah.
glossed over. I thought he could have been much more interesting. Yeah, but yeah, like you're right. He shows up at the end along with Jesse Plemons' character to help sort of.
When he was
solve the
a
case.
vital piece of the investigation. A lot of the investigators under Tom White's command had to really sort of work their asses off to ingratiate themselves with the Osage in ways that like they weren't exactly trusting of outsiders, especially at this point. But one of them, there was one who set himself up as an insurance agent to try to, like help out to get them to bring their, their insurance policies to him, try to, use that as evidence against the people who were taking out or, signing off on these incredibly reckless and falsified insurance claims. So, yeah.
Curious about that because when they have their little meeting in the field there, one guy is like, "I just sold him a fire insurance policy not a month ago," and I was like, "Oh, is he an investigator or is he an actual insurance man? What is he doing here?" I kind of glossed over that as well. He's
Mhm.
got like they have a whole team, and one of them who you could have focused on more, especially, is the he's not Osage, but he's a Native American detective who comes in
Yeah.
to help try and solve the
Mhm.
case.
Right.
I
Yeah.
I
So
didn't wanna cut
that
you off though, John. You were saying more. Go ahead.
no, no, that was it really. Just I mean the idea of just writing off the FBI is just another bunch of white people that are probably have nefarious intentions. Like it's just maybe that was just an agency that were trying to bring justice to people, and it wasn't just white people. You
I
know.
I think if I'm trying to be charitable, what's I think what she's probably trying to get at is the idea of where the focus of the film is, right? Like if the focus
Mhm.
is on the investigation, then that places the Osage people as more like sort of accessories to the narrative rather than critical to it in a way, right? In the same
Oh,
way that the
actually,
person who's killed in a murder mystery isn't like the focal point of
Yes.
the mystery, right?
yeah,
Yes,
I
though I would
agree with
add
that.
that
I'm
making
glad
the
it didn't unfold like a police
Yeah.
procedural where we're just
Uh,
following the
well,
feds.
the thing I would add to that, and then I'll let you continue, is that, I think you could say the same thing of making the villains the main characters.
Yes, right. Yeah,
um
I mean, well, this is a point I wanted to bring up earlier, actually, because I think like Lily Gladstone, she's not the main character, but she's the heart of the movie, I think, and that's
Yes, and
that's
I think
like
she can be the heart of the movie still, even if we focused a bit more, if not entirely, or primarily, I should say, on the investigation.
that's the
yes,
thing I
and
was trying to sort of get to. Is like I don't necessarily begrudge the film being structured the way it is right now, but I don't think it is also I also don't think it's impossible for the film to focus more on the investigation while retaining uh the sort of presentation and framing that it has.
yeah, and I think making Ernest the main character over Molly makes the film function better as an exploration of greed, which I think
Yeah.
is what the film is fundamentally trying to do.
Yeah, the film
Yeah.
is definitely, and this is true of a lot of Martin Scorsese movies, it's focused on evil and trying to understand it. And like, like, he makes a lot of movies about awful people. I think in general, I've heard him talk about this, he has kind of a cynical attitude towards people. There's some quote somewhere where he's talking about how, like, there are Travis Bickles everywhere, Travis Bickle being the character from Taxi Driver. Um, he seems to have,
I would definitely,
broadly
yeah.
speaking,
I
a
would
cynical
say that
attitude towards people, and
he definitely finds the scumbags to be the more interesting kinds of people to tell stories about than the ones who
yes.
are not, the ones who fly in the face of that narrative in a way. Um,
Yeah.
like Tom White, the real life Tom White, who kind of his existence kind of maybe shows that there are good people out there. I would think that maybe he'd like to focus on that a little more at
Yeah, I
points.
mean, I certainly would have been it would be curious to see what this movie looks like that primarily focuses on the investigation from Tom White's perspective. Perhaps I'll just go read the book if I want that. I think he could have balanced it more because as is, I do sense a sort of cynicism in the movie, or at least a focus on all the worst aspects of humanity and then kind of like glossing over the good.
But
Um,
my opinion on it after reading the book and seeing how much of it is focused very intently on the investigator and how little Ernest is a character. He's sort of an antagonist in the shadows until the very end when the trial comes up and they sort of reveal some of the. But knowing that he deliberately made the choice to avoid the character in the character of that the book thought was interesting, that the author thought was the one who kind of gave the narrative some hope and some drive to go with the story of the greedy antagonistic character almost exclusively, not entirely exclusively, but he does focus a lot more on Ernest than on any of the other characters. And I don't think that that's an impossible thing to do, right? I think it's effective, and the performance from Leo is really driving some excellent work. But
he's great in the movie. I don't know if that's been said yet, but he's incredible.
I just wish that there had been. I wish that he had been able to sort of put some of his own biases aside and focus on, because there is a very interesting, unique guy in Tom White there, and he kind of gets under. Now granted, maybe this is something that would have happened anyway, given how he was treated by history in general, but he's kind of overshadowed by the villainy of the whole thing, despite trying to bring.
Well, if nothing else, if nothing else, they could have gone for maybe a better balance between the two.
Yeah, that's all I'm. That's what I'm. That's
the duality of man sort of thing. The Jungian thing.
Whose side are you on, soldier?
In regard to the cynicism, I would say that this has always been sort of Scorsese's thing. Like
it has,
like all his movies are kind of like this. They all follow this pattern of like bad guys do bad things, and then the FBI comes in and fucks everything and handcuffs everybody. Like almost every Scorsese movie is like that. It's kind of hilarious, actually.
And that's
and I think part of what makes this one so interesting in that regard, as a study of what Scorsese's interested in, is that was an adaptational choice. That he didn't just adapt the book super faithfully in that regard. He made the choice to focus on him, and it's an interesting one. I think we've said quite a bit about Ernest so far. Are we still talking about Molly? Because I think for the most part, I really like her character. Find her very compelling, and whether she could have been the main character is that's kind of a tricky thing, like we said before, because she spends so much of it sick in bed. I do like that she is kind of the heart of the story, and I think they do pull that off well. I think it's the way it's presented in the story, I can totally believe why she fell for Ernest, and I find a lot of her performance very believable, very understated in a good way. I think the only time that I kind of where it falters for me in terms of her characterization is this final scene. So she's gone through a lot of the movie thinking that Hale and her husband are on her side, right? They're on the side of the Osage. She doesn't know that they're a part of all this. And she's getting sick because she's being poisoned and all that sort of stuff. And then she's starting to get better when she moves away during the trial. And then at the trial, she finds out that Ernest admits to being complicit and points to Hale as being the mastermind behind the murder of most of her family. And then we get one final scene with her and Ernest where they're in a sort of back room of the courthouse, and she asks him if he's told all his truths. And she's not sobbing, she's not angry, she can tell she's emotional, but she's rather composed in this moment. And she says, "Have you told all your truth?" And he said, "Yes, it feels good to have gotten it all off my soul, right? That I've come clean." And then she says, like, "What did you give me? What was in the insulin?" Something to that effect. And then he chokes up and won't admit to knowing, or at least deeply suspecting, that they were poisoning her. And that seems to be, at least the way the movie frames it, as like the last straw for her. And then she gets up and immediately leaves when
as
he
if
won't
it
admit.
hadn't been broken already. Yeah.
Yeah, and so that's my thing. That's what bugged me about it, especially as the like final reckoning between the two characters. is that it really comes down to like, were you poisoning me, yes or no, and not like, I can't believe you murdered my whole family. I
I
think
think
there's
Yeah,
I think a
I
lot of
agree with. Sorry, go ahead, Theo.
I just wanted to like I don't know. I think what that scene's trying to get at is or what she's trying to get at even is how, forgive the pun, earnest his feelings towards her are in a way. Like
Yeah,
hmm
if he is if he's willing to come clean about this, that says some. I don't know if that necessarily means that she will take him back or whatever. I would imagine not. Like it's portrayed. I would agree. It's portrayed as more ambiguous than it probably should be as to whether or not she would be willing to reconcile with him if he had like come clean
yes.
there.
Uh-huh.
But I think the more pressing thing in her mind is a matter of whether or not he really actually cares enough to treat her like an equal, like a human being, not like sort of
Yeah.
property in a way.
Yeah,
yeah.
I
I think
understand that. Go ahead. Go
the
ahead.
it does seem to be like her prioritization of what's upsetting her seems to be off there. But I
Yeah.
would say the scene that made it really glaring to me is not the last scene, but the scene before it, where he's in court and he's admitting all these things. And then, like, for most of the time, it hangs on him on a close up. But I think briefly it'll cut to her and you see her reaction. And her reaction is kind of muted. Like, considering what he's divulging here, like, you'd think, like, she would be more upset. But I wonder if, like, during the whole time she was sick, she's already figured out, like, he's trying to kill me. And then, like, she spent all
Um,
that time processing it.
Hmm.
And then by the time she's in court, she's kind of over it, where she's kind of made the decision at that point. Like, I don't really love this guy anymore. He doesn't love me. And so that's why she's kind of muted at that point in the story. I'm curious what you
I,
guys think of
I
that.
think one thing that would conflict with that would be that the last scene we had between those two before the trial where he finally confesses is they're in the middle of this field and they're like meeting for the last time, or so to speak, and they put their faces nose to nose. It's in the trailer. I think it's just showed up on screen actually. It seems to be a rather emotional moment, and I do think that the movie's trying to convince us that she really doesn't have any idea until he finally confesses
Hmm.
that Ernest is actually culpable in all of this. Because she's very kind of they're sad, obviously, but she's very lovey-dovey with him, in as much as you
Right.
can be in the
Yeah.
sad circumstances.
Yeah, I forgot about that
Um,
scene actually. Yeah, I mean, you could be right. Yeah, it could just be an error in the filmmaking, you know.
well, I maybe not error because I think that's believable that she could really have kind of believed and trusted in him the whole time up until the trial. To your point about her reaction during the trial itself being muted, I don't have a problem with that because they are so the Osage are so emotionally
Stoic.
subdued, stoic. Yes, I can believe that a lot is happening in her head that she's not showing on her face,
Yeah.
especially as they're presented and as she's presented, especially throughout the movie. That didn't bother me so much. I could understand wanting a bit more, but I didn't have a problem with it.
If I could just jump in real quick, because one of the things that I found very interesting going through the story is that Molly, in in the real situation, Molly remained convinced all the way up until he reveals everything on the stand, that Ernest wouldn't have ever harmed her or her family. She said as much in newspaper interviews that ran in the Washington Post and the New York Times, evidently. And one of the big issues with that is that she ended up being ostracized from the rest of the Osage tribe because they could all kind of see the writing on the wall, right? They all knew that this clearly had to be Ernest, right? If they hadn't deeply suspected before, then they were convinced by this
By the
point.
time he was arrested,
By the time he was
probably,
arrested and
yeah.
Hale was arrested, and so she had lost a lot of the connection with the tribe in this moment because they just didn't trust her anymore, or they didn't see how she could continue to defend him Um,
Stand by her man.
and yeah, during this moment, and she finally was convinced at the trial when he confessed, and testified against Hale. And I wonder if that might have been a more interesting way of exploring Molly's character, to see that she's choosing this hope that she has for her husband over her own people, and to have her not, she's not vindicated by it. She makes the wrong decision, but to see her struggle with that choice and the consequences of standing by him despite, and believing in him despite his falsity. I feel like that could have been a much more compelling way to do the same sort of thing that they attempt to do in this last scene, where the final straw is that he won't come clean about poisoning her.
Yeah, one of the things the film does early on is that, like, it's one of my favorite scenes in the movie where he's like first courting her, I guess, where she's like, "Do you want dinner?" And then he comes in, and then they sit down at the dinner table and they have this conversation where he's like, "Man, you're pretty. You got a great house." And she's like got this look on her face like, "I know what the fuck you want." Like she's
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
she
Yep.
plays it so well. And she calls him a coyote in her native language, and then he demonstrates his knowledge of the language, saying, "You just called me a coyote there, didn't you?" And she's kind of
Mhm.
impressed by that.
Yeah.
And then so like she's attracted to him physically, but she also knows basically what he wants. And so I wonder if that's kind of playing into her lack of reaction at the end, where it's just like, yeah, I should have figured all this shit. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, maybe there's another to your point, there's another scene that kind of shows that she knows that there's that sort of greedy side to him. When she's talking, I don't remember exactly how she phrases it, but they're at one of the weddings or get-togethers before they get married. She's talking with her sisters and other female friends, Native American Osage friends, and they're talking about like, what do you see in him? He's like a snake. And she's like, oh, she says something to the effect of like, he wants the money and he wants a nice life and he wants to sit around. He's not going to run around on me. Like that's a
Yeah, well,
big
she says
concern
coyote,
she
right?
has.
He's not a snake, he's a coyote. Like
Yeah, I think
using
it's an
animals to sort of define
Mhm.
character traits. Yeah,
I think it's an interesting bit of character for her that she's like, I know he wants me for my money also. Like he's open about that. And that's one of the things that kind of endears him to her is like, yeah, the money would be really nice. Like, but I just like I won't pretend like I'm not in it partially for the money. Money's great. I just kind of want to sit around with my beautiful wife in a nice house, that, and she kind of likes that or appreciates his honesty, if nothing else. And then she's clearly worried about finding someone who's going to run around on her when she's like, no, he's not that kind of guy. It's interesting.
She
Like,
she
go
finds him
ahead.
like charming in a goofball kind of way. Is
Yeah.
the way it
Yeah.
comes across.
They had some
Yeah.
fantastic chemistry together, by the way. I just want to
Oh, they do.
address
Absolutely.
The first scene we get where he picks her up in his cab.
that.
There's a line, I
Yeah.
believe it's in the trailer, where she says something in her native tongue. He doesn't yet understand what she's saying. And he says, oh, that must have been Indian for handsome devil. And she kind of laughs at that. And he, he's like laughing and checking in his little rearview mirror to see if she's laughing too. Stuff like that. And the scene where they kind of endear themselves to each other when he's courting her and they're at the dinner table and they're about to have some whiskey. She's like, do you like whiskey? And he's like, oh, I don't just like whiskey. I love whiskey. Like, let's try some. And then the storm comes. I thought that was a really interesting bit of like cultural detail that like they're about to drink and everything, and she stops them and says like, no, we need to be quiet for a while the storm comes, because they need to have this, calm, meditative, spiritual moment, I guess. And he keeps trying to talk, and she's like, nope, just be quiet. Just shut the
Yeah.
fuck up.
well,
Yeah.
he wants to drink too. She's like, no, don't put
Yeah.
the drink
Yeah.
down.
Mhm.
Apparently, that
And-
beat in the car where she says that in something in her native language, and then he says "handsome devil." That was ad libbed apparently by Leo. It wasn't even in the script. And you
Wait,
would think
really?
that would, you would think that would be in the script, right? Because it's so
Yeah, you would.
key
Yeah.
to sort of winning
Yeah.
her over. right? Because that
Mhm.
laugh at the end that she lets out, it's just like, okay, I like this guy. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah,
it
that
feels
is
like there's
really
a
key. I'm actually
definitive
kind of
switch in that scene there. Yeah.
yeah, I'm kind of surprised that wasn't in the script. You'd think you'd want something like it, if nothing else.
Yeah.
I do want to respond to a couple of super chats. James Moore, thank you very much. It says, as part Native American myself, my grandma is 46%. We love to victimize ourselves like some other people. The story's about greed, not race, in my opinion. We all can and have done bad, no matter the race. That's definitely true, and I think if I were to, it's tough. It's tough to say that like there's a weird balance between telling a story like this and portraying the Osage purely as victims tyrannized by awful people and like giving them some like this is a very hard thing to do to appease everybody in terms of how the story is portrayed. And I think getting back to that earlier point that they tried to focus on just how evil the people victimizing them were to 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 to
To
not
a little bit to the
they
detriment
didn't
of the.
well, I was just gonna say, to be charitable, they don't wanna make light of anything, right? They want
Oh,
it to
look.
be as ugly as it was, and I think that's the real impetus between how it's portrayed. Setting aside whether people today like, whether that's the best way of telling the story or not, I think that is what they were going for. They wanted it to be as ugly as it was. They wanted to show the ugliness in all its horrific glory to make sure we don't shy away from that, which I can appreciate. I can definitely appreciate.
I think that's why it's so long suffering. I do also want to disclaim quickly. I think this film is absolutely about race. Like, not
Yes.
entirely, not to like the expense of greed, but race is a huge component of it. Like even just the opening scene, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, not
I
just on the part of the like. I think Hugh, you mentioned that scene where the old couple are looking at the toddlers, and they have this kind of uncomfortable
yeah, that's the
conversation.
most overt racist scene, yeah.
Molly's mum bemoaning that
Yeah,
all of the Osage women marry white men.
but there's even
Mhm.
Yeah, well,
conversations
That's a
on
big
the
part of it.
Osage side of it, where they're talking about the lightening of their blood, right? So I
Yeah.
think that's on
yeah.
both sides. They're talking about the lightening and darkening of blood and mixing races and whether one is good or bad. Like there's a bunch of uncomfortable conversations, I think, on both sides.
And
Um,
it's
I
as
think
far
I
as
think to the super chatter's point, I think, I would assume, based on how he phrased it, that he's sort of saying that, like, that the villainy doesn't run along that villainy and heroism doesn't run along racial lines, and that like that's not necessarily the point of the story. That the white characters are evil, and that the Native American characters are purely good, and that sort of thing. There
Yep,
is a little bit of there is complexity in the story for sure.
yeah.
right.
I agree with that.
Adam Milne has just found out I have 9 audiobook credits. What's everyone's favorite book? Also, hi Theo.
Hello.
Hello, Theo. Um, everyone's favorite book. I do have an answer for this. It's In Cold Blood by Truman Capote. Really like that book. It's very, very good. One of the first like um, true crime novels, and it's excellent.
It's a very good choice. I'm gonna go with The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. It is one of the darkest, like blackest comedies I have ever read. It's not particularly long, but it is really, really funny and very it's great. I highly recommend it.
It's embarrassing for me because I'm not a big reader. I like the Harry Potter books. I think they're good.
Yo.
That's
No, for me it's Catch 22 pretty easily. Catch 22 is excellent
Damn,
though.
no one said the Bible. What a bunch of heathens.
Damn
Can't
true.
believe it. Um, yes. So back to the film. That's the gist of Molly's character. We have some big players. There's a lot of time spent in the first half with some of these side characters who will do some of the murders on behalf of Hale and Ernest. Some very interesting figures. Like Blackie, I believe, is one of them, and oh god,
Blackie Thompson.
I can't remember. Blackie
Well,
Thompson.
Blackie steals the car, doesn't he? Does he actually kill anybody?
Yes.
Okay.
He was supposed to,
Yeah,
but he doesn't.
he was. He's the one who's supposed to. He's supposed to pull off the murder of Bill and Rita, right? Or is it Henry Roan? He's supposed to pull off one of the murders, but they kind of go on a. He gives him a little side quest to steal his car for the insurance money, and he ends up doing it before he's committed the murders, because of course he does, because it's the easier thing to do, and he gets caught. So now they need to find somebody else to to commit these, to plant the bomb or whatever they were gonna do. So
right,
yeah. Well, so we were on Blackie Thompson because side characters. Is that what we're focusing on?
Yeah, I guess whoever
going.
like Hale or Ernest wants to do like a gig for them, so they don't have to do the dirty work. Sometimes it's Ernest, sometimes it's
Asa Kirby, I think, was another one. He was the guy who see the guy with the dynamite, I believe, is him.
It's AC something.
Yeah,
AC Kirby.
AC is. I'm pretty sure AC was like his Asa Kirby.
Yeah, he's
Ace.
AC Kirby. That's right. He's like the demolition expert. He's the guy that you go to if you need something blown up.
He's that trope from.
Oh, and we have Bill Smith and Rita, the other sister, the ones who get blown up. Who,
speaking of the blowing up, I want to get to that point, because a lot of the murders they've been doing have been more subtle. But then someone at some point has the very bright idea, well, if we want Bill and Rita to be killed at the same time, we should blow them up. I don't know whose fucking idea that was, but that's...
this is one of those things that's like...
move.
It's fascinating, especially from a historical standpoint, too, because like at how he managed to go from being super upset that Henry Roan was shot in the back of the head so that it looked like murder to, yeah, why not? Let's dynamite their house and put a fucking crater where they used to be. It's like, you were all about subtlety, and now you've decided to go bold. Now, I think in the movie they have the whole thing, like, he used too much dynamite, which is not something that they mention at all in the book. Very
well, I mean, that hardly seems like the problem. It seems like the problem is that you blew up a house in the middle of a residential neighborhood. That seems to be the problem.
Like, no amount of dynamite was going to make that plan work, buddy. I don't think.
Yeah, there's some kind of like not like it's not stupid for the sake of the plot or the movie. Like it's not unbelievable or impossible. It's just there's some very dumb decisions made. That being one of them. The other one being letting that guy steal the car before he commits the murders. So Blackie, it was like, we want you to kill this person for us. I think it was it Anna that he was asked to kill?
Oh, is it Anna? I thought it was Bill and Rita.
I think it was Bill and Rita, wasn't it? Who was supposed to handle that?
Either way,
because they go to the dynamite after he gets arrested with the car.
Oh, true. Right. Okay. So you're gonna have to kill these people, and we'll pay you this much. And to sweeten the deal, you can have my car that you've been eyeing. You steal it, and then I'll claim the insurance money. Everything will be hunky dory. And then before he commits the murders, he steals the car. It's like, man, why would you do that first?
Well, in regard to the guy getting shot in the back of the head, I mean, I know it's like stupid, but there's something to the fact that he's not willing to shoot him in the front of the head and look him in the eye while he's killing him.
Oh yeah.
Oh, no. I understand the reason why that doesn't happen. It's Hale going from being super upset at that being not subtle enough to the point that it's like, no, that looks like murder. It was supposed to look like a suicide, right? He was trying to cover his tracks. But he goes from that to dynamiting a house. Yeah, because those are both his plans, right? So it's like...
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. One thing...
I think we could...
Go ahead.
Sorry, just quickly. I feel like I don't know if there was something and I missed it. Maybe we could have done with a quick throwaway line just to square away how exactly blowing up a house is going to be in any way subtle enough. Like, it doesn't have to. I don't know.
Not
I
the
know
most
it was.
subtle
I
option.
know it was too much dynamite, but assuming the
Yeah.
correct amount of dynamite, what's the story?
What does it look like here? Like,
Yeah,
what are
it
we
was-
planning?
There was a gas
Yeah,
leak and someone lit a match. Like what?
something, at least, yeah, it just like I don't know what their thought process was there, but maybe it was something like a gas leak, and a throwaway line would have been good.
Well, I think the real
Maybe
thought
that.
process was that Hale was so confident in his ability to to pay off the local authorities, such as they were, that he just didn't really care about that in particular.
But he
Even
cared a lot about the suicide not looking like a suicide.
because he wanted to collect on the insurance money for that one, right? Like if it looks like murder.
Oh,
Yeah, I just remembered about that. But if it looks like murder, then the insurance company might be like, you took out a big policy on him for $25,000.
okay.
Now he's dead. Yeah, so
That does make a
Then
little
he
more
kicks up a
sense.
fuss over that.
yeah.
I mean, he does. I quite like that bit, because once
Yeah.
Jesse Plemons shows up, the tide starts changing, and
Yeah.
among other things, he tries to collect on that life insurance policy, and they're like, "Sorry, corporate says we can't give you the money," and he's like, "Do you know who I am? You'll regret this," that sort of thing. But like things
Yeah.
are starting to unravel for him. Quite
It-
like that.
It's a thing I like a lot about Thomas White's portrayal in the film is he comes across as very understated and like maybe even incompetent in his first scene but that's because he's the public face and he's basically just showing up to rattle the cage while
Yeah,
everyone else who's in there undercover or like not working out in the open can then get to work after everyone like on Hale's side has been sent reeling by the fact that there are investigators afoot now.
I
yeah.
think
He
that's
kind of
something Jesse Plemons does really well. Is like
Yeah.
he's
Yeah,
like a sort of
yes.
friendly face, but he's actually like serious opposition who can get shit done.
His
Like, whatever
conversation with
the role
Ernest is
is.
perfect for that when they
Oh, I
first meet.
love it. Yes. And he's Jesse Plemons, love him as an actor. He's incredible. But I do really think there is something to like when he shows up and Ernest is like, "Yeah, she's sick." And he's like, "Well, I can come back tomorrow." And he's like, "Tomorrow's probably not good either. What about Friday?" And instead of pushing back on him and being more forceful in that moment, he's just like, "Okay, I'll come back Friday."
Yeah.
And you might
Yep.
interpret it like you said, like he's maybe not as good or savvy, but he's there to like put pressure on them, and he's being kind of friendly. And he has a conversation with Hale when he's getting his shave, and he's talking to him, and he's like, they said I should come talk to you, and he's like, and Hale kind of overplays his hand. He's like, well, it like maybe it could be Negroes, or maybe like, hey, this person, he was a melancholic, so he probably killed himself, and he's being a little, he's being he's going overboard, and like,
Yeah.
well,
Right.
here's all the ways that you could explain away all this stuff, so really nothing wrong happened here, and it's like,
Unsolicited explaining.
yeah, exactly. And he could be more forceful in the moment, but he rather definitely is just like, well, thanks for talking to me. Sorry to interrupt your shave. Maybe we'll talk again later. He's kind of nice, puts a nice friendly face on it, and like clearly is there to rile him up, but he doesn't want to let on too much that he knows or suspects more than he does, because that might push them to do something more extreme. There's all sorts of reasoning behind it. I think a big part of why I would have just wanted more on him is because he's great. He's really, really great.
His
Yeah.
portrayal is great.
Yeah,
I think that's also a recurring thing in Scorsese movies broadly, where you have like a federal agent character who's just like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever you want. And then as soon as like the main character reveals themselves or reveals a vulnerable part of themselves where they can get, arrested, it's just like, you're fucked now,
There's a good scene for that in The Wolf of Wall Street, right? Where
oh yeah, that's
he's
what I was
meeting on the
thinking of.
boat.
Yeah.
Yep, that's a really good one.
Yeah.
I must say, like there's a few moments of laughs in this movie, some more gallows humor than others, but every single time, like this trailer was everywhere. I went to the movie theater quite a lot this year, and this movie trailer was in front of basically every movie I saw this past year. Right? It was wall-to-wall advertising, and every single time I saw the trailer, when Jesse Plemons goes, "See who's doing them," like I laughed out loud every single time
Yeah.
because it's so good. There's a
Yeah.
couple lines like that, and like, "Oh, I sure do love that money, sir." There's a couple line deliveries and moments that will kind of stick with me for a long time just because they're so simple but effective. Jesse Plemons does this little like blink as he's saying "See who's doing them" that really gets me too.
Yeah.
Anyway,
It
he's
almost
great.
sounds kind of dumb, but like it's just such a straightforward answer because that's what it
Yeah.
boils down to is a guy did a bad thing and I'm trying to find the person who did it. That's it.
Yeah. See what about them? See who's doing them.
Yeah.
It's great. I love it.
And
Let's
then him
see.
acting as like the moral center later on in his conversations with Ernest is a pretty nice pivot for the second half when, like his role as the understated FBI man has sort of come and gone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think in contrast in like Wolf of Wall Street, the exchange on the boat, it turns sour at the very end where like they sort of play their cards fully
Yeah.
on the table where like
Doesn't he start
the
throwing money at him?
Yeah,
Yeah.
because the Fed
Yeah.
detects that Leo tried to bribe him, and he's just like, "Can you say that again, verbatim, like exactly what you just said?" And Leo, at that point, he's just like, "Oh, fuck you! You're just trying to trap me here. Like, get the fuck out of here." Like you said, throws money at him, just tossing insults back and forth. Like, it's so good.
I think there's I really like when the investigators show up. I think I've mentioned this briefly already, but like there's a scene when Tom White is talking to an old timer who was sitting across the street, and he's like, "Now I know, like my son's told me not to tell anyone what I saw because Hale's dangerous. He's gonna have me killed, but my time's almost up anyway." He's a nice little interesting character here, and he tells them that he saw. Contrary to the story that had been given to police at the time, that they didn't take Anna straight home. They took her out to a bar and got her good and drunk and then killed her, right? So that's a big part of a piece of evidence that starts to implicate them, right? My only problem with some of these scenes is I feel like they would hit harder if we didn't know some of these things. This is a trickier thing to figure out how they would go about it, but if there was some sort of way of like delaying some of this information so that the full scope of just how, like, if we didn't get their entire plan right from the beginning, I don't know if there was anything to reveal when the investigators show up, I would have found it a bit more compelling, because as is, I'm like, yeah, yep, nope, they did that, that's for sure. We already kind of know that they killed Anna, so I'm looking for some sort of way of like delaying certain reveals, even if it's just going to be like the full scope of just how evil Hale and Ernest are. That might make the back half a little bit more compelling.
Because they do delay like exactly how it went down. Like much later in the movie, you see exactly what happened, where like they shoot her sister.
Yeah, and by then it's like
but,
I know this essentially.
Yes, exactly right. They don't delay. Like you immediately know as soon as she died. Like you know what happened, who killed her.
Oh, there's a little tiny detail that I thought that said it better when they're finally at the trial, the guy who was hired to kill Anna along with Ernest's brother, Byron, was that his name? Something like that?
Yeah.
I think so.
And he's confessing to the crime in the courtroom, and we're just seeing the scene of him confessing it to the lawyer, right? And then we see Byron coming home to Hale's estate, and he lays down on the couch, and Molly puts a pillow under his head, and he's like, "Oh, thanks." Like, and that's a nice little moment because it's like, oh damn, she doesn't know that they just killed her sister, but she's still being nice to them and accommodating, and like that's a nice little gut punch in its own. And then they cut from that to the scene of them shooting Anna when like it has already been described in pretty specific detail how it went down. I'm not sure why we're seeing it again if we're not learning anything from it. There's little moments like that where I thought the subtlety of Molly putting the pillow under his head was more effective than seeing the crime itself. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, the movie's full of like little things like that for me. On the whole, I still think it's quite good. There's just like little moments I'm like, oh, maybe we could have done something like that. Um, well, we've hopped around quite a bit to different characters and different plot lines and anything like that. Is there anything else anyone? Oh, I suppose a big thing to get to would be the epilogue. That's a
The epilogue scene, the Lucky Strike crime hour. Uh,
What did you guys think of the epilogue to this movie?
That shit threw me for a loop the first time. I was very confused as to why exactly we were portraying things in this manner. But
Yeah,
I think I'm trending a bit more positive on it. It's still, I'd say, probably a very jarring inclusion, though I'm not sure exactly if I mean that in a negative way, and I think I'd have to see the film again to be able to say for sure.
Yeah, I
yeah,
very much. Honestly, I really enjoyed it as a way of doing these better than doing the standard epilogue text. At the
on
end
screen.
on screen at the end of a movie where they kind of show you a photo of the actor and the real person who they were playing, and then they let you sit there and read like this is what happened to this person and all that, and it's a really nice touch because it really did happen. That was one of the very first episodes of that particular radio broadcast, and it had been engineered by J. Edgar Hoover to use this case as sort of a way to get the FBI, which had now been officially formed, some decent PR, through radio broadcast. So
Mhm.
I liked that part all the way up until like right at the end when Martin Scorsese comes out to read the obituary. I took a little
Yeah,
bit of
let's
issue with that. Um,
let's build up to that.
yeah,
So, for anyone who hasn't seen it, the movie, though it's been taking sort of an objective view, bouncing around from character to character, it decides to do to show this like old timey radio broadcast where people are making sound effects into microphones as it's going on. It's kind of, I don't know if campy is the right word, but it's definitely it's got a sort of silliness which kind of
melodramatic
contrasts.
is a good one, I think.
It
Like,
contrasts in a way that is jarring, though, like you said, not necessarily in a bad way, with the somber nature of everything that came before it. And they're telling you everything that happened afterwards, right? The big pieces of information here are that despite both being convicted for life sentences, respectively, Hale and Ernest were both released from prison early. I think in both cases, something like 20 or 30 years later, something like that.
it might have
Um,
been less actually.
I think it was about that much for Hale. I think Ernest was let out sooner. They didn't cover this, but apparently in real life he was let out, then he was convicted of like armed robbery or something and then went back to prison
And then he was
and
let
then
out
was
again.
released
Yeah,
later. Yeah, they kind of gloss over that, but that's fine. We get a little, so I think there's an effective gut punch in the fact that despite all this work and despite getting convictions, now this wasn't mentioned in the movie, but there were many trials and retrials and appeals and hung juries and things before it finally went to the Supreme Court that they upheld a life sentence for Hale, only for him to be released early on parole from prison. That is a bit of a gut punch because you're like, oh, after all that, after finally convicting him and everything they had to go through to finally put this guy behind bars, he just kind of let out early. That's kind of a gut punch that hits pretty well for me anyway. Um,
yeah.
it's always been baffling to me when you hear like this person was sent away for life in prison and then they're let out 20 years later. I'm like, what's the point even?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, and
Sentencing them
I
to
think
life in
the
prison.
official reason that they cited for giving him parole was because of his advanced age. In quotes, there he was 72 when he was released. Um, so they were like, "Oh, he's old now. Like, what threat could he possibly be?" And they let him go, and not in a dissimilar way to other mobsters, throughout
Yeah.
history in America. So there's a couple of the kind of hits on the idea, and I think there were a couple theories from people at the time that he had paid people off, or he had somehow managed to pay off the parole board or bribe the parole board into giving him a favorable, review, which is
Yeah.
interesting. Um,
It's possible.
yeah,
Yeah. So we find out that the same thing happened with Hale. Sorry, not Hale. Ernest rather, that he was also sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Bill and Rita, and he was also let out, and he lived in a trailer with his brother in Arizona or something to
No,
that
it
effect.
was in Osage. He ended up
Oh, was
getting a
it?
pardon to
Oh, it was Hale that was in Arizona. Yeah.
yeah. He Ernest applied, so he was part of his parole the second time was that he was barred from ever entering Oklahoma again. But he
Okay.
appealed to the governor of Oklahoma, who granted him a pardon and let him come in, which is
Thing.
kind of like that's a bit of a gut punch too. When you think about it from the perspective of the victims or the children
Yes.
of the victims, like
Absolutely.
and his own son, who was still living on the reservation. He moved, into a trailer on the edge of the reservation, and his son would go back and visit him every now and then. But he was trying to reconcile this man who was his father, who had, as far as he knew, like been willing to let him die in order to get money.
Yeah.
Especially in that one night. Um, so
It is kind of a gut punch that they don't stay in prison forever and that they actually find their way to worm themselves back into Osage
into
territory
the
or for that
communities
reason.
where they
Hmm.
wreaked
Yeah.
this havoc is just
So that's a good gut punch. And then we get to essentially there might have been a couple other small details there, but the film's intended big gut punch which is reserved for Martin Scorsese himself, who comes on screen to read sort of what happened to Molly afterwards. That she eventually died of diabetes, and and then he reads her obituary, which I don't have the exact wording
I can get
of,
it. Give me a second.
but the big final line, I don't know if we need the exact wording. The big final line is that in the obituary there were no mention of the murders, and that's according to that's definitely the intended final gut punch of the movie on behalf of the film. I don't think that works especially well. Um, if for no other reason than it's actually not all that surprising that a non-murdered person wouldn't
Wouldn't
mention the
yeah,
Osage
I
murders in an obituary written by their family in a newspaper.
Right.
I
yeah.
don't,
What
and that's
exactly
so
did
that,
he think that we would expect the obituary to say? Is the thing that kind of drove me a little nuts about that line is like it wasn't going to say Molly Burkhart passed away, due to complications with diabetes. She was this many years old. She's survived by, these people. Also, back in, the 1920s, her entire family was murdered by a couple of criminals. Like, that's not how anybody wants to be remembered. That's not how anybody wants to remember their dead relative. That's not something
that's
that
not
would have
how
been published in
obituaries
an
are read.
obituary. That's not what they're for. Okay, like there was plenty of news stories written about this at the time. There were
Yeah, so
newsreels
I'm
nationally.
gonna stop you there only because I think this ties into what is part of maybe maybe a main theme in the film, at least in the minds of Scorsese, and I think Eric Roth is the name of the writer who helped him adapt this story, is that this is the untold story that was kind of like swept under the rug and, forgotten because no one cares about what happened to Native Americans. Before we talk about what actually happened according to the book and other places, what did you guys think? Did you sense that theme as well, or how did you guys feel
Yep.
about that aspect?
I think the almost comedic tone of the epilogue thing is part of trying to get that idea across that the the events were very much made light of, or almost, or like became a footnote in a way.
John,
That's
what do you
interesting
think?
that it was like deliberate because I mean, like turning it into a whole performance like that, where you see the Foley artists doing all the sound effects, kind of like watching the guy from Police Academy doing sound effects, where it's just like
Yeah.
it's like you're trivializing the whole thing. It feels like, but I guess that's sort of like Theo was just saying, it's deliberate on Scorsese's part because he wants to emphasize the idea that it was all sort of overlooked and trivialized. But like I did find it jarring overall. And then Marty came on, and I was just like, I don't know if I'm okay with this. Um, But like, if it was any other director, I would have had more of a problem. But like, because it's Marty and because maybe it might be his last film, I was just like, I don't know, maybe he earned this one. But like, I feel if I was in his position, I still wouldn't want to do this self-insertion sort of thing. But I did like the scene that came right after it with the flower ceremony thing. It reminded me of
Yeah.
Schindler's List, where there's just like this huge time jump, and then you see how like things have gotten better since
Rare
the events
uplifting
of the
note
story.
from Martin Scorsese. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
because the end of Schindler's List, like everyone pays respects to Schindler at his grave. I thought that was cool. It felt a little bit like that to me, but like that Foley artist like stage performance thing. I mean, it's a little better in my mind since Hugh just confirmed that that's actually what they did. So, I guess it's accurate. But like, I don't know, it just felt like it made the
I
whole
think where
thing
my
seem a
main
little bit cartoonish.
I think where my complaint comes in is that there seems to be this attitude in the movie, and especially with that final line that, like, oh, there was no mention of the murders in her obituary. Isn't that sad because this story was brushed under the rug because people don't care about this story and what happened to the Native Americans. And I think
Yeah.
what I have a problem with is when you find out based on reading the book or if you do any research into the story is that that's not really true. At the time that this story happened, it was all over the national news. Like this was a big story. You knows more about it than I do. You can take it away.
I am wondering if it might change your mind about a little bit about this scene, to know that even though it is accurate to how the FBI sort of sponsored the Lucky Strike, crime hour radio show, um, this murder story was not, hidden, covered up. It was everywhere. The New York Times, the Washington Post, the LA Times, like all over the country, people were talking about this. The trial was followed very closely in the New York Times because it was a federal trial. People were outraged at the treatment of the Osage people, like nationwide. There were newsreels about it that ran for weeks, which is longer than the usual ones did. People
Mhm.
kept up with it very, very closely, to the point that Ernest Burkhart's big dramatic reveal in the courtroom that he would testify was colossal. Like it sold tons of papers. It's a bit disingenuous on the part of the filmmaker and a little bit on the part of the author in the book, because the author is clearly aware of the fact that this was a big deal at the time. But the author does also do that thing that sort of maybe not revisionist historians might be a strong word, but that modern takes on history kind of take that. I didn't grow up hearing about this in high school. I didn't see it in my U.S. history, broad survey textbook. So it must have been brushed under the rug. Why wasn't like it seems like a much bigger deal. But this, going back, to the 1920s and even the 1930s and just before this trial, while it is gruesome, huge deal, especially for the people in Oklahoma and the Osage who lived it. It's not really going to make like a top 5 list of the most important, groundbreaking changes historically speaking in that era of history.
Such
that it would be
in like a high
covered in
school
covered more than a
textbook.
footnote in like a high school textbook, right? Like, but it's not that it was covered up. You can go and find the information if you have if you especially now in the age of the internet, but before you could go and find this is not the first book that was written about this. There have been several throughout the years that have been written by either survivors or the children of survivors or the children of victims, or by journalists in Oklahoma who were affected by it more closely. It's not really a surprise to me that the author of the book, who grew up in New York City and Connecticut, didn't hear about it when he was younger, just because these kinds of crimes, the trials of the century things don't really stick around, in the minds of the people who weren't there. Like people know about the O.J. Simpson trial now, but like in 20 more years, people
Probably
probably
won't.
won't have, people won't know as much about that, right? I mean, there's Al
Yeah.
Capone's trial. People don't really know too much about that. Um, it's just it struck me as very disingenuous for him to get up there and use the obituary as sort of like the final bit of evidence that this story was not told ever and kind of was like forgotten and brushed. Now it was forgotten in the way that most of these crime stories do tend to be, but it's not that it was covered up. It's not that it didn't make news. It's not that people didn't
It's
care.
not
It's
that no
just
one
that
cared. Yeah.
they figured it was resolved after the trial, and they kind of just went, "All right, well that's done. What's next?" And
Yeah.
it sort of faded from collective memory. So I was a little annoyed by that particular kind of bit at the end, especially after reading the book. It only bothered me a little on the silliness of expecting an obituary to talk about murdered family victims at first. But getting the feel from it throughout the movie and then going and reading the book, it soured me a bit on the way that they portrayed it.
Yeah, that
Yeah,
makes a lot of sense.
I agree. Yeah, I mean that it didn't actually occur to me at the time, but I agree with what you're saying. I mean, there's definitely a difference between sort of like overlooking something or being ignorant of something versus conspiratorially brushing something under the rug. Like we don't want this ever seen or acknowledged by anybody. And yeah, I mean, if I were to die and have my obituary written, like I don't know if I'd want like the plight of a group of people sort of to be a part of that. I don't know.
If I'm gonna write my like if I'm gonna ask somebody to write my obituary now, and let's say my brother gets murdered, I don't want in my obituary, years after that event, his brother was murdered, at this age, he died at this age. Like that's not really something that I want to be remembered by. I wouldn't
Yeah.
expect that to be.
Yeah,
I think regarding the idea that this story was brushed under the rug, that's why you don't know about it sort of attitude, that you don't know about it because the story wasn't told, because I think like some character says earlier in the movie, and I don't know if this is in the book or not, but you're more likely to get arrested for kicking a dog than killing a Native American, which is like a little bit true in this town, especially because of how corrupt it was. This is almost more the story of like mob corruption than racism, though clearly racism is a part of it. I'm not saying it isn't, but there's this attitude that I think the filmmakers and the film itself takes. One bit of evidence towards this is the final scene with Hale. Hale is talking to Ernest, and he's like, "None of this is going to matter in the long term. The people will forget this. This will be just another common tragedy. People will move on. Like no one will care about this." And it seems to be that the film is suggesting, oof, that's sad because it's true that no one cared about this and no one cared about the Native Americans, when clearly at the federal government level they did care. They did care enough to like spend lots of time and resources to help try and solve this case. And in terms of public broader interest, there was a lot of it. There's a lot of it at the time. And I think there's things like that are left out of the story for the sake of this like only at best half true narrative that like this story was kind of buried or forgotten because fuck the Native Americans, and I just don't think that's true. And I think there's something a little dishonest about that presentation of it. It's not the whole film. It's not like it sullies every little bit of it, but I do get that distinct impression that that was sort of what they wanted to convey, especially with the ending.
Well, and
Yeah.
one detail that they did make a specific change to is the attorney who offers to help the Osage by going to Washington, who gets murdered in the Washington hotel. Right? He gets the telegram that says "Be careful," and he goes outside to leave, and two people jump him and stab him and leave his body in the gutter. Right? Um,
Yeah.
at one point in the movie, they say something about how that man just disappeared and they don't know what happened to him, right? Like he just fell out of contact and they're not sure where he went. And they cut to a scene of his body there, and it's an interesting change because in real life his body was found. It got a national headline. The Osage people found out about it, and the Washington Post called it the most brutal murder in the annals of the District of Columbia. And the national headline was "Conspiracy Believed to Kill Rich Indians." And that's sort of what jump started national interest in the whole affair. So
Yeah.
I there's a lot of little details like that he deliberately took and changed to support the idea that this got no media attention whatsoever. Nobody cared enough to, step in or to, pay attention to it, and that's why it got forgotten. Not just that it was a big crime that happened a long
Everyone
time
was
ago.
talking about.
That everyone was talking about, that happened a lot. It was like it was the gossip of the
Mhm.
country for months, and then it stopped being the
Yeah.
gossip of the country. Like
I think you could definitely, if you wanted to make a point about how this bit of history has been forgotten, you could make that point about how we don't remember this story anymore, and that's itself like, if we're being charitable, you could say that the fact that this has been largely forgotten is unfortunate, but I don't
Yeah.
think you can honestly say that it wasn't cared about at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's a couple little other tiny details that do kind of fit this theme of how we're approaching the story in terms of things that happened in the aftermath that weren't talked about. So one example I found doing a little reading today, I don't know if this is in the book, but this is on the Wikipedia article. In 1925, so this would be after the trial, the United States Congress passed a law to bar the inheritance of Osage head rights by non-Osage people in order to curb the Osage Indian murders. That seems like something of a small victory, at least in response, or a good thing that was done to try and prevent this from happening again. Little things like that. It just felt like the ending was more so about the injustice than any justice that came from it.
Well, and I'm surprised
mean?
that wouldn't have been mentioned. That's not mentioned in the book either, which is like, as I was finishing it today, that kind of irritated me a little at the presentation of the book because, like I said, he does that thing where, he never heard about it growing up, so it must have never been, talked about or people must have never been concerned with it. But the fact that he doesn't mention that the head right, which this head right issue is kind of what caused, at the very least, it caused the gold rush of
definitely.
murdering, of murdering
That's
these
the whole
people. Like,
That's
yes,
the whole
like
reason.
they passed a law to stop that, or to attempt
It
to
just
stop
it just
it.
that's a smaller thing for me, but the fact that they didn't include it just tells me that when it came to the epilogue, they were more concerned with remaining injustices than any good that was done afterwards, to try and help
Right.
or to try and fix
Well,
anything.
I guess what irritated me about the lack of mentioning it at all, I feel like either way, like if in the maybe not in, I think in the film it would have been nice to have it, but in the book it definitely would have been something that I think should
Yeah.
have been mentioned, especially considering that he spends the greater part of the third section of the book talking about how when he was going through the records, he a couple of basically uncovered a couple of murders and he figured out that there were more like several hundreds who were killed, and like at least every Osage family had one relative who was a victim
Yeah.
of
Oh,
this.
yeah. I'm very glad you brought that up because I feel like if you wanted that big gut punch at the end, you could talk about how they were only really focused, that is the FBI and the federal government, and maybe a lot of people who were interested in the story, they were really focused on tying as much of it as possible to Hale at the expense of all the other people who were killed by other people doing a similar scheme. killing their husbands, killing their wives, that sort
Yeah.
of thing in order to get head rights. And you could
Right.
talk about how, because of the high profile nature of this one case and this one or two trials, you could talk about how, not enough attention was paid to all of the other people that this happened to who didn't fit neatly into this one mastermind story.
When you
That
could
would
also
be a
talk
way of,
about the fact that a lot of those weren't even classified as homicides because the coroner, the only available coroners, those two brother doctors who were in on a lot of the schemes, would basically qualify the poisoning deaths as alcohol abuse, right? Like death
or
by
wasting illness,
Wasting
or
sickness,
yeah.
yeah.
like you could
Or
talk about that
suicides.
about that issue. You could talk about Charlie Whitehorn, the guy in the nice white suit who gets shot in the back of the head. His murder was never investigated because the
Mhm.
people who committed it, I'm pretty sure the author of the book ended up basically figuring out it was very likely his wife, who was white, who hired a hitman, and then she basically died without being able to give a confession because at that time there wasn't forensic evidence wasn't as big of a thing. Fingerprinting and all that was just starting to become common practice, and it hadn't spread to this sort of unregulated, unincorporated state of Oklahoma yet. So the only way that they really could have convicted anybody of a lot of these was if they got confessions, and a lot of these people were, scummy, shifty people who were involved in other crimes and ended up dying before they could confess, before anybody could wring confessions out of them, before anybody could make connections with circumstantial evidence. So a lot of these
Yeah.
murders are unsolved because of that, because of the lack of
Yeah.
ability and the lack of
And
resources.
that is addressed to quite a degree in the very beginning of the movie, because I remember watching it again. I'm like, in the trailer, there's a guy who gets shot kind of at like dusk or whatever. Charlie Whitehorn, I believe, is his name. And there's a whole montage of like, this person died, no investigation. This person died, no investigation, to kind of set the stage, right? And watching it again, I'm like, wait, was Hale involved in any of those? No, he wasn't actually. These are just other murders happening for similar reasons at the time that were never investigated. You think if you were to tie it all together at the end, and you wanted to focus on all the justice that didn't happen at the end, you might want to bring those up again to mention that, like, yes, these people were convicted and attention was brought to these crimes, and there was justice, even though they were released early. But all these other ones weren't. That seems just a little bit like a missed opportunity.
Mhm.
Yeah, I would agree.
Yeah, so that's the ending. um,
Well, we have jumped over probably my favorite scene in the whole movie is when Leo is trying to convince Molly. Ernest is trying to convince Molly to take the insulin. She doesn't want to take it because she's suspicious of it, and they have an argument. And he puts in one of my favorite Leonardo performances of his career, which is saying a lot because I like a lot of his performances. But it's when he
you mean the one where he like finally reveals a little bit of racism?
yeah, where
It's
he
about that
mocks her religious beliefs.
Goes a bit mask off, you
Yeah.
know?
Yes.
the
It was
medicine
a little
man
much.
and
I think that's a very,
Yeah.
very telling scene.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
I was joking with my brother when I said I was like I can just hear the director behind the camera going, Leo, your line was just take the damn insulin, please.
Well, I wonder if
He's
that
a
was
very
just.
committed performer.
I wonder if that was like. I think there's deliberate ambiguity there again, like with many other examples, where it's just like, yeah, that was probably an outlet for some of his racism, but it's also
Mhm.
just like this insulin I think is really going to help you.
Yeah. Oh,
So
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
please take it. You know.
Yeah, he's
'Cause I
clearly
don't want
very
you to
annoyed.
die. Yeah.
Yeah, and you could read it like he actually does care about her, or you could read it more cynically that it's like, no, you can't fucking die before these other people die. I swear to God, just take the damn insulin.
Yeah.
You need to outlive your sister. All right, I know we're trying to kill her, but you need to outlive her. So just take the fucking thing.
It's a
Yeah.
very good scene.
Very telling. One other thing that I quite liked as a little detail, that runs as a sort of tiny thread through a lot of this stuff that I think really worked and really kind of filled out the like the attitudes of some of these characters is that I think from a lot of the sort of shifty, more conniving white people in this town who are clearly looking to fleece Native Americans out of their money, a lot of them resent the Native Americans for not having earned it. That shows up in a few scenes.
Yeah.
No, because like
Yeah,
they
that was
they make a specific point of saying it in a few scenes. A few characters are like, "You didn't earn this money anyway." I think when they go to buy a coffin for Anna, I believe it is, or one of these characters, he's like, "No, you're giving me the Osage prices," and he's like, "No, I'm not." And it's like, besides, you can like she can afford to pay, and like it's not your money anyway. He's saying this to Ernest, like it's their money and they didn't earn it. Like unlike you and unlike them, I work for a living because the Osage discovered oil on the lands. Now clearly some of them we don't see any of these people really, but some of these people are actually working the oil rigs and doing all that sort of transport and stuff, but we don't really see any of them because this wealth is divided up among all of the Osage people. A lot of them are just being given the money,
Well,
who are like who
they lease the mineral rights. So what, like, basically they lease the rights to the land to the companies to drill the oil out, and the companies have to pay them, a certain amount of percentage per barrel.
yeah.
So they're not.
Yeah,
Most of
but
them
I
aren't.
just
Most of them weren't doing the oil drilling themselves.
yeah. And
No,
so
but yeah,
there's
they
this
had the head
attitude.
rights to get those funds. Yeah,
Yeah.
that share of the income. Yeah.
Yeah, and so I think a big part of the motivation behind a lot of these, the people grifting, the people trying to fleece them from their money, stealing them, or like just, working for them, there's a sort of resentment that like, well, they didn't do anything to earn this money. So like, I don't have any problem taking it from them or, you know, conning them. That was a really interesting detail, and I thought it kind of fleshed things out a little bit more because you can kind of understand someone like that, especially around this time. Most people were not very wealthy at all, and so it's like like resenting these people not just because they're they're Native Americans and maybe they see them as lesser, but also because like, oh, they have all this money they didn't even fucking earn. So like, there's nothing really wrong with me stealing it from them, or there's nothing really wrong with setting up these guardianships to like determine like who gets their money and when, and like kind of insert ourselves as middlemen between them and their money to make sure they're not wasting it. That sort of thing. There's a sort of sense of like, well, they didn't earn it, so who cares?
it's fundamentally un-American, isn't it?
Yeah, I know what you mean. Like they just kind of, they're on their land and then they just stumble across a reservoir that's on their territory that bursts out of the ground. It's just, oh, we're rich now. It's like, well, if I had only just lived there instead of you, I would have been the
Yeah.
rich one, right?
Yeah.
So
I thought
real
that was a
quick,
really interesting
in
bit
the
of
chat, James Moore saying it's set during the Great Depression. It is. It is not. It is the Osage Reign of Terror took place between the official dates are like 1921 and 1925. So it's
So,
before the Great
the Roaring
Depression.
20s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So and it's
in
during
between World
in
War
the
One and the Great
midst of
Depression.
Prohibition too. So that's another thing that kind of did end up just to go a little bit back to the idea that the story was sort of brushed under the rug. Prohibition and the crime wave pretty much across the entirety of America in that era did sort of overshadow it a little bit in the history books, moving forward. But
Yeah.
like this stuff like this was happening in a lot of places. It was just happening way worse to the Osage. So
Yeah.
yeah, the Great Depression actually kind of screwed the Osage over very badly because the oil prices plummeted, and that turned and they had no other wealth, and they hadn't been allowed control of their wealth in a lot of cases. So their exceedingly lavish lifestyles that they adopted with all this money kind of dried up, and they ended up pretty much all living in poverty for a while.
And that's an interesting bit about this story. It's like a lot of these Oklahoman white folks did look down on the Native Americans, but they were like their servants and things.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting dynamic that hasn't really existed a lot of other places in American history. It's very there's a lot of historical interest here, which is why most of my criticisms are things that like I just thought could have been more true to life or could have been explored more deeply. But like what is here is very interesting, very compelling. It's like I know Theo said at the very beginning that the atmosphere is a big part of what really works about this movie. I think there's a sort of tension in the air throughout the whole movie
Hmm.
between different people like fighting to get each other's money and things like that. Really good.
It's a
I
sort
really
of
like that aspect of
social,
it.
the sort of social environment that I don't think you could find elsewhere. It's really,
Yeah.
really unique to this place and this time.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it was a time where you had all these small towns just growing into what would become big cities, but there weren't really any huge cities back then. Like, it was
Especially in
all
the
just
West.
there's
Yeah.
an
Well, yeah.
intimacy to all the towns back then, where you sort of knew, well, you were at least familiar with everybody in the town, I think.
And this is one of the really fascinating things that I learned from just doing all the research on this is that Oklahoma was one of the last states to be incorporated as I think it was like number 48 or something. The only two that came after it were oh no, it was 47 because afterwards were New Mexico, Hawaii, and Alaska. So the old West had kind of faded at this point, but it was alive and well in Oklahoma. So people kind of did like a reverse gold rush and came back from California. All these like bandits and outlaws kind of did a U-turn from California and came back to Oklahoma at this time
Yeah.
because of
Well, that was
how lawless it
yeah.
was.
And that was a big part of the interest in the story at the time is that like, oh my God, all these like sensational stories coming out of Oklahoma where the Wild West still exists, even in the modern world. That was kind of
Yeah.
part of what drew people to the story and why it was national news, you know?
And one of the I think Blackie Thompson, I'm remembering right. Blackie Thompson he pulled off the last big train robbery in the United States in Oklahoma at this time, like right before he came here. Like so people were kind of, enamored by this idea, the way that Americans tend to be with criminals.
Yeah.
Right.
I want to give the movie a lot of points, and I mean like truly a lot of points for the way they depict the culture of the Osage, and I thought there was a lot of really nice details to that effect. One of the first things that really struck me is when nefarious and evil as he is, there's a sort of respect that Hale has for the Osage, and that kind of shows up when Ernest shows up and he's talking to him about his time over in France during World War One, and he's talking about what he's going to have to do to be successful here. And one of the things he says, like the Osage, they may not talk a lot, and so you might be tempted to fill the silence, but don't do that because they're quiet people and they think white people talk too much. So if you want to look smart and you want to get in their good graces, don't just yap all the time to fill the silence. Don't talk nothingness. Talk when you have something to say.
Yeah.
And like, and they call it blackbird talk. And like the little details like that do a really good job, especially in the very beginning of setting up some of the cultural differences. And then when you meet the Osage, yeah, they are rather maybe stoic and reserved in some ways. Some of them anyway. And some of them, especially the younger generation, are more like the white people around them, much to the chagrin of the grandmother, Lizzie, I believe is her name.
Yeah.
Um,
John had
and
mentioned
but
that
like
earlier too. The whitening or the lightening of the blood
Well,
was
that's the weird thing, right? Is that Lizzie, by the end, she didn't really like Molly, and she much preferred Anna,
yeah,
when Anna had much more of a no way to put this without being crude, more of a white attitude, like I guess, But it's because she had
yeah,
more
Right.
like passion and fire to her than Molly, who was
yes.
very much more of the sort of stoic archetype.
And
And
also,
I
I
think
think
that
she resented. She didn't like Ernest. That
Yep.
seemed pretty obvious from moment one. So that she would marry him, she didn't like. She might have liked something about the fact that Anna didn't marry any of these white men yet, though she, everyone
yeah.
seemed to know she was sleeping around with a few of them. She wasn't
Mhm.
marrying and having white or like mixed race babies. So she liked that about her, I think.
I
for
think
sure.
the competence among the Osage is really emphasized with Molly's introductory scene. Like it
Mhm.
opens with a close on her, and she's talking with her money manager, because it was back then it was baked into the law that, like, despite how powerful and rich these Osage people were, they had to have their money managed by court appointed black or white people. Sorry, and
Yes. And that was something
th-
that kinda
they
sorry to
were
interrupt you, but that was something that kinda left out is that, like, she says a couple times, like, she declares herself as incompetent. It's like
yes.
a lot of them were, like, deliberately designated as incompetent as if they couldn't be in charge of their money.
Right. Well, that was why they had the white people, like, it was in the law that they had to manage their money for them because they were too, quote unquote, incompetent to manage their money themselves. Like, it was
Mhm.
just one of those
Yeah.
dumb, objectively racist things that was baked into
Yeah.
Yeah, well,
the code of conduct at the
I
time.
did a little bit of research on that one because that was one thing that I did feel like I would have liked to see more in the movie, just a little bit more of an because one of the problems that I had with it was like, what do you how what does it mean she's incompetent, right? And how did it get this way? How did we get to this point? And I had to you know, kind of dig into it a little bit, but basically, like, yeah, the letter of the law wasn't necessarily that they were automatically declared incompetent, but the way it was employed was that anybody who was full-blooded Osage or even half-blooded Osage was just like, there's no possible way they can pass this financial literacy test that we're going to give them. If they pass, it must have been a fluke, so we're just going to declare them incompetent, which is just baffling, but not
Right.
surprising.
And
Honestly,
horrible,
given
and
American.
Well,
and perhaps a little
especially in Molly's introductory scene, because as she's declaring herself incompetent, like, you look in her eyes and you can tell there's a lot going on there where she's like
Yeah.
sizing up the guy she's sitting across from, and like she's clearly not incompetent. Like, you can tell just from a
Yes.
glance she's actually
Yeah.
quite sharp. And that's sort of like you definitely get that sense throughout the entirety of the movie, right? But I just like that right off the bat in her first scene. It's like, I'm incompetent. It's like, I don't think you are. No. Like,
From
there's
her quick
clearly a lot going
understanding
on
of
there.
from her
Yeah.
quick understanding of Ernest's intentions, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's a sharp character.
That was a
That might
cool, like, it regard like a scene that introduces a character. I thought that was quite clever, to
Mhm.
do
Yeah.
something like that.
To add to the points of praise for the depiction of their culture and how much like how interesting and compelling it was. I already talked about this before, but a scene I really liked is when they're about to drink and have a good time, but then the storm happens. So she's like, "No, we need to be quiet now. We need to have a peaceful moment where we just sit in the storm and let it, experience it in a sort of quiet, meditative state." That was a nice little character detail, cultural
Yeah.
detail as well. I think there's another one in particular that I had in mind. Oh, what was it? Oh, the stuff with the owl.
Oh yeah,
There's
yeah, the
when
owl that
when
shows up.
the grandmother is kind of wasting away, she's towards the end of her life suffering from whatever sort of illness, wasting illness, I believe is what they call it. They don't really specify with her. She's seeing an owl in a vision, which I like that the way it was presented was very like matter of fact, as if the owl was just there. Because and I think in lesser hands, you could have tried to make that more surreal, but I liked how kind of matter of fact it was. The owl shows up, and it's a sign that she's near the end of her life. And then we get a scene when she finally dies, where they're outside in some sort of little structure with branches, above it, almost like an upside down boat. Um, and as she's dying, then she sees this vision of there's like an old chief or something like that, wearing full body paint and a headdress. And then there's a couple different figures who we've never seen anywhere else. They're like ancestor spirits or something of the kind. It's not specified. I really
Yeah.
like that it's not specified. And then we see her. They accompany her. They walk away and walk into the afterlife or something of that nature. And I really like the decision to show that, to depict that in a really
Oh yeah,
matter of fact and simple way. I thought that was very effective and really kind of touching little bit of acknowledgement of
Yeah.
their sort of sacred traditions and beliefs.
Just the way they view and interact with the world.
Hmm.
Well, regarding the owl
Especially,
shot, it's interesting that you say matter of factly, because I got actually a surreal vibe off of that. Is the first shot where the owl comes in when the old lady's dying? It's like
mhm,
filmed straight on, where it's like
yeah,
facing straight towards the window. Owl flies in and it stops on the floor, and then it flies straight towards the lens. Like you don't usually shoot things like that unless you're trying to sort of make a particular point,
yes.
where
I
like you
think
shoot something straight on. It almost seemed like is she hallucinating this, or was the owl actually there? Like I don't know if it was confirmed in dialogue. I can't remember, but I'm not sure.
I
The owl
think
isn't there. It's
yeah, I think so
fairly
too.
And because they cut away
I guess
from the scene, and we see her in the same position without the owl being present,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
but
Which
just
I really liked
to
how they
clarify,
handled the surrealism in like
Yeah.
I mean those scenes that we're talking about here are really well done. Like the owl,
yeah,
the funeral procession, I guess you could call it, or the guiding to the afterlife. And the owl recurs with a couple other characters, and I like it's a nice little that it hits a few times. I really enjoyed how he shot those and how they were edited together because right
mhm,
after she's led away by the chief or the brave or whoever's covered in paint and the other ancestor spirits, we cut immediately to the scene of Molly weeping over her body, and it's
Yeah.
mhm,
really powerful. Just
yeah.
excellent work.
I thought
Just
that was really
just
well done. Yeah.
Just to be clear, when I'm talking about like, because there is something surreal about it in how it's presented. Like you said, it's kind of in the proscenium way. It's very shot directly on. You know, it's kind of it's more subtle surrealism, if you want to call it that. I think what I mean is that in lesser hands, it would be like dreamier, and I don't know, you'd shoot it on like a really shallow depth of field.
Mhm.
Like there's things you would do if you were not quite as subtle or sophisticated as Martin Scorsese and his cinematographer are as artists. If you wanted to communicate that this is a sort of dreamlike thing that's happening, but there's something very subtle and matter of fact about the way they shot it. Like when the ancestor spirits, for lack of a better term, show up, they're just there. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We don't do
Mhm.
anything too stylized. Is sort of what I'm getting at.
He doesn't oversell it, which is something I appreciate about a lot of this film in terms of
Hmm.
the violence as well. The violence isn't
Yeah.
overly dramatized or anything. It's very, very stark and shocking in that way.
Yes, often shot at kind of a distance,
Yeah.
in terms of how it's presented. Like, I'm thinking especially of when I don't remember his name, but he kills the melancholic Osage guy. He's supposed to make it seem like a suicide, but he shoots him in the back of the head. We see it from fairly far away, and there's a few. When we finally see Anna's death, we see that from like roughly the same distance, and the camera's just locked off on a tripod, pointed right at it. Like there's no movement, there's no slow mo or anything dumb like that. There's nothing to stylize it. It's just there it is, very matter of fact. Very this is what it looked like.
Yeah.
Very kind of objective.
This is what death looks like. Yeah.
I
It
Yep.
love
reminded
the
me of the shot in Godfather 1 where the guy gets killed in the car. That's
yes,
where
yeah, with Clemenza.
yeah, leave the gun, take the cannoli. It's that scene
Yeah,
where it's
Yeah.
just shot from a wide angle. Yeah.
and one of the
Yeah,
scenes in
very.
this movie that I like, I'm speaking of the violent stuff, is the one where the woman with her baby carriage out in her front yard is shot by a
Oof.
man in
Yeah.
her in her house. The camera
Jesus, yeah.
movement in that scene is immaculate. It's so good. Like the way that especially when I was rewatching a little bit of the first one, when you see the gun out leaning out of the window, as it pans up from the baby carriage to her walking towards it, not looking at the house. The gun is hanging out of the window pointing at her. She turns around, and then she like it's shot, and we get this like long wide take of the guy walking out of the house and picking the baby up and taking it back in. And like, fun note, well, maybe not fun, that was the woman's father-in-law, and that child wrote a book about her great grandfather's handling. Like, basically, he would lie to her for her entire life, about who killed
What
her
happened to her
mother.
mom? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah,
That's a very fun fact. Thank you.
yeah. It's
Yeah,
just like, I mean, insane, horrible.
No,
But yeah.
I'm just yeah. I think there's a real maturity and subtlety and sophistication to the way the film's presented visually. Very not flashy, not stylized, but still beautiful. That I find really remarkable, and I think is evidence of how talented of a director Martin Scorsese is. And I it's a stunning movie from a visual standpoint. I think it's remarkably well edited too. I think I've said at the beginning, but it's very true and worth repeating that for a movie that's 3.5 hours long, it has very good pacing.
Yep.
Better pacing than I could have ever expected from a movie this freaking long. Um, he's a very talented director, and like in terms of putting together a movie, boy howdy, can he sure put together a movie. My most of my criticisms come from how the book was adapted and what he focused on and what he didn't focus on. But man, this
Yeah.
is really masterful direction for the most part, I would say.
I think you
Yeah,
can give a decent spot of credit for how well paced it feels to the music as well. I think the soundtrack carries the
Mm,
energy forward, in like, because it's not
yes.
high energy. It's very like slow and rumbling, sort of bluesy music with
yeah,
Native American influences in there, which is very very interesting for the subject matter. Uh, and yeah, it just keeps things like treading forward at a very steady pace rather than trying to oversell moments or being completely absent. It's just there to prop things up, which is really really good.
yeah.
The
No, I
the
totally
music is
agree.
really well done. I mean, not just on its own, but what it does in terms of pacing. And then you made a point, Capital, much earlier on about the pacing of the movie, and I just wanted to add to that about how like the movie kind of zipped along for me. Like there was only one or maybe a few scenes where the dialogue went on a little bit, where I'm just like, oh, maybe you could cut like a minute or two out of this. But even
Yeah.
then, I was thinking, like, you know what? I actually appreciate the additional time spent soaking in these characters. Like, particularly at the beginning with where Leo first meets his uncle, and he's just they kind of
Hmm.
go on a little bit. But like, I kind of just liked the dialogue. Like, I liked the exchange. I liked learning more about him. And then
Yeah.
obviously you get to that important theme stated moment in the screenplay, basically, where he just outlines his like he's greedy. He
Yeah,
establishes
Yeah.
that. And then it's just like,
Mhm.
oh, okay, this is gonna be the thing that fucks you at the end, isn't it?
I mean, like
And then that's
Yeah.
exactly what happens, right? So
something as
I
simple as
appreciated the time that it kind of sat with the characters, but for the most part, I felt like it really zipped along.
yeah. In that first scene, just something as simple as how long they spend giggling like idiots over the whole Blackbird talk thing while he's going like cheap, cheap, cheap.
Yeah.
Yeah, it lasts for a couple of beats too long, and definitely like on purpose. I think
Yeah.
it's
The
it's
other one that
supposed to be a
comes to
little
mind
awkward.
is when they're talking about like, do you like women? He's like, oh, I like women. It's like, and he asking questions like, when you're over there, you remember to like keep yourself
You
wrapped
kept
up,
that
right? You don't
thing
have any
wrapped up, huh?
diseases.
Yeah.
He's like, and then
Yeah,
he's like, as best you could, right? Ha 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 ha. Just
right.
like, what are we doing exactly?
Yeah.
And he's like, what
Yeah,
kind of women did they have over there? He's like, well, white mostly.
yeah.
He's like, do you like red? He's like, I like the way he responds to that because Hale asks him like, do you like red? And he's like, oh, you mean like that kind of red? Like he doesn't even know what he's talking about at
As
first.
opposed to like
It's,
redheads or something like that. Yeah, I
yeah.
don't know what he was thinking,
He's
but
like,
yeah,
I like red, yellow, blue. I like them all.
Purple, I like them all.
yeah.
I like his accent makes a lot of these scenes especially funny. Oh, one of the funnier ones to me is and I don't even know if it's supposed to be funny, but it is when he's talking to the guy who will eventually kill the melancholic guy, or maybe he did already. He's like, "We need you to get AC Kirby." And he's like, "Well, like I'm not gonna do it right now." And it's like, "I don't want to lose this job." And he's like, "God damn it, John! Like, just like,
Yeah, they
go
starts,
do it." Like he starts yelling at him, and it all plays in one unbroken take where they're just arguing with each other, and he's like, "I like, well, just know that he wants it done right now. I'm gonna go tell him. I'm gonna go tell him we're gonna do it right now, okay?" I don't. There's something about the delivery in that scene that is very amusing to me.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of good stuff. Go
I'm
ahead.
curious what you guys think of Leo's performance in movies broadly, because I often have arguments with a friend of mine where he thinks he's too much of a try-hard actor, and
Mm.
I think I kind of agree with him, but I'm a little warmer on him. Like the glaring example of his tendency to overact, I think, is The Revenant, where like he feels like Leo tries too hard in that movie.
I have
I'm
not seen
I'm a
The
little
Revenant.
warmer on that, but I'm kind of
You haven't?
I'm not I don't hate it,
No, I haven't
but
seen
like
it.
I wonder if his tendency to like really like lean very hard into whatever character he's performing, it works better for some roles and not so well for others. Like I think in The Wolf of Wall Street, he's like perfect. Because
Yeah.
that I think when he's playing Jordan Belfort, that his tendency to like I don't know if you call it overacting. I don't really want to put it that way because I feel like it's too
It's
mean.
very like
Because I do like him as an actor, but like, you guys know what I'm
I don't think
talking
I'd
about?
call. I do know what you're talking about. I don't think I'd call it overacting either. But he's very animated,
Yeah,
especially in
I
The
think
Wolf
it's
of
very
Wall Street.
energetic.
I think one
Yeah.
of like I guess the point that your friend is making about him being a try-hard actor is that he kind of does those sort of. I mean, there's that meme about like the Oscar baity sort of thing where it's like the Oscars really only recognize you if you yell and throw shit at the wall, kind of stuff. You know, like, and Leo has a tendency to
Yeah.
do
Yeah.
that, right? Like the famous example being Django Unchained, where he unscripted smashed a glass and cut his hand and then rubbed his blood all over Kerry Washington's face.
But he's
But
so
it's-
good in that.
He's
though.
really
Yeah.
the thing that separates him in my mind from like other performers who do similar stuff is that his subtlety in other moments is very often overshadowed by these bombastic kind of energetic performances, these
I agree
scenery
with
you.
chewing things, but everything about his subtlety is so good. Like his fundamentals are so solid. You know, like you would say about a basketball player. Like he's just really good at making you believe he's a different character every time. And
Yeah.
I think there are some performances I've seen from him that I haven't liked quite as much. I don't really care for him in Gangs of New York.
oh, okay, yeah, I'm not.
It's
a
not
huge
one of
fan
his
that
better
movie.
movies. I would not be surprised that it really comes down to the director because I have heard this I don't know how this rumor came to light, but that on this movie, on Killers of the Flower Moon, there were scenes and moments where Leo would try something and then Marty and Robert De Niro would be like, well, what are you doing? Stop. Like, don't do all that. You know, I forget. You can look it up. There were articles to this effect talking about how they kind of made fun of him for some of the more embarrassing try hard moments he had. So I wouldn't be surprised if, because a lot of actors, especially the really good ones, they really like to just try things and play and see what happens. And I wouldn't be surprised if that's kind of the person he is, that he's really going to go for it. And that if he's working with a director who's not willing to tell him no, or if he's working with a director who's not willing or isn't able to go, maybe we could push it more in this direction, or maybe we can save that big moment for later, yada yada, or like maybe we can tone it down, do a little bit less. If he's not working with someone like that, he just kind of does whatever he thinks might work, and then they just put it in the final movie. I
Yeah,
think
I think
in Scorsese movies, except for maybe with the exception of Gangs of New York, the ones that I've seen, I think he's really strong. And I think in this, Scorsese seems to really know how to use him.
he is overall strong. I agree. But like there is that part of him that like will take things a little too far and then he needs a director to sort of reel him in and be like, no, not that intense. Bring it down a few notches. But there's times where that really does work. Like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think, is another example of that. Tarantino's
He's
movie.
He's really good in that movie. Yeah.
Well, he plays an actor who's sort of washed up and he's trying to cling to his former glory. So that actually works. That's sort
Yeah.
of like, again, I don't want to use the word overacting, but he tends to just like really go for it. in like I guess his initial takes of whatever he's filming.
The word
And I
that
guess
comes to
that
mind is
worked for the
arch. I don't know if I'm using that right. You know what I mean? Is
What?
arch the word I'm thinking of? Where it's like of a performance that it's kind of it's big and for lack of a better term, over the top. It's like I don't know if I'm thinking of the right word. Maybe someone in chat knows. But there are words for this that aren't overacting because I think there's like understated and whatever the inverse of that would be, where it's
right.
like like I've heard people complain. We talked about this on our like Halloweeny stream about it. Is that people complain sometimes about Jack Nicholson in The Shining, and it's like, yeah, he's doing a lot. He's
Yeah.
he's very animated. He's very almost silly, almost campy, almost overacting, but I think it really works.
Yes.
And
I
the
agree.
line that keeps coming back to mind is Jack Nicholson talking about working with Stanley Kubrick, where he says a lot of actors will be like, "Oh, I'm going to make it real. I'm going to make it more real than you've ever seen it before. You've never seen this sort of thing as real as I'm going to do it." And Stanley Kubrick would say, like, "Yeah, it's real, but is it interesting?"
Right.
And I think there are certain actors who can thread a needle and go a little more animated, a
Yeah.
little more energetic, for whatever term we're thinking of here, and pull it off without breaking your realism of like, okay, would someone actually act like that?
Yeah.
He's very good, I think,
For real.
like really, really good at doing exactly that, right? Like he does have a tendency to kind of go crazy at certain points.
Hmm.
But he's I think the best end of the spectrum, is like Nicolas Cage, who does it all the time,
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
Leo never
Nick
quite
Cage is
hits
like
there,
that turned up to like he's like the definitive example of that, I think. Where it's just
Yeah.
like
yeah.
it's like I guess overacting. I think overacting would be the term to use in some of his movies. Like
God,
he just like turns it up to 11 deliberately.
Or Jim
right?
Carrey sometimes.
yeah, Jim
Yes,
Carrey is
exactly. Right. But like in some roles that does work perfectly. Like
Yeah.
the Grinch, for example. Like
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah.
he's perfect for that. Absolutely perfect.
Yeah, and
I also
Jack
want.
Nicholson does
Go
have a
ahead.
tendency to do that too. Like, I watched a movie recently called The Witches of Eastwick, and he
Oh,
is
that is the campiest movie. Yeah.
yeah, and he is like, especially towards the end, he is cranking that shit up to like 12.
Well, that's
He's
like a Coke. That's a Coke fueled 80s movie if I've ever seen one.
For fucking sure. Al Pacino has a tendency to do it too, especially in his later stuff when he's on, like when cocaine is his
Yes.
co-pilot. Like he
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
just way too over the top. I think Leo has stayed away from the coke because it's been frowned upon more often. So I would assume that that's probably the reason why his have never quite reached those levels.
Have you
Right.
have you ever heard that clip of or it's been brought up a couple times before that Leo's advice to Timothy Chalamet was no hard drugs and no superhero movies. If you want a long,
Good
successful
fucking
career,
advice,
no hard
dude.
drugs, no superhero movies. Yeah, seems to
Never
be
heard of
working
that.
out well for both of them, at least for now. I'm
Yeah.
really, I want to draw a little attention back to Robert De Niro, who I think maybe has the opposite problem these days, where he doesn't give a shit in a lot of movies he's in because he's in there for the paycheck. But man,
Right.
he's really knocking it out of the park here. You can tell he really cares, and I think it's a lot of credit to Martin Scorsese, because I think sometimes in common understanding, I think it's often neglected that essentially the most important thing a director does is work with the actors, right? I think sometimes people have the idea that the director is the guy with the singular vision of exactly how it's going to look and how unique and stylized and whatever their work is. But like, to be a good director, what you do is you get good performances from the actors. Back in the day, like the person who was kind of like the main name on a movie was the producer. Like, a lot of old movies, 30s, 40s, 50s, it's like the director wasn't the most famous or most prominent person. It was the
Right.
producer, and they made a lot of those big calls. They were the auteurs, if anything. And
The person with the money.
yeah.
Yep.
The
But
Kevin
then, like,
Feige's.
but
Yeah.
Martin Scorsese, everyone seems to like working with him, and he gets really good performances out of people for the most part. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for that. You know, he
Yeah.
does work with Leo and Robert De Niro over and over and over again, which, you know, maybe you could have criticisms of, but I
Yeah.
think he gets really good work out of them. And I think both of
And
them are well cast in this movie.
one of the things I really appreciate about Scorsese is that he will embrace things that actors bring to the table, like on the fly, where it's just
Mhm.
like, oh my God, that works. Yeah, that's great. I didn't even conceive of that, but yes, we're going to keep
Yeah.
that in. Whereas a lot lesser directors might go like, that isn't what I wrote in the script. Do it again until it's the way I want it. You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah. I think I saw some clip of Joe Pesci talking about how one of the great things about working for Martin Scorsese was that, like, if it was really obvious, like when you would do things that surprised him, it like brought him joy, and he'd laugh and he'd be like, "Oh my God," his eyes would light up when you do something really interesting. Like you were acting for him essentially, and he'd give you a lot of good feedback, you know, because he's very invested and he's really thrilled by actors doing really good work. So it was very, very easy to work for him.
yeah.
Yeah. Oh, and speaking of like a kind of a criticism of overacting that I actually think works very well is Brendan Fraser in this movie. Uh, I thought was
I was
great.
so shocked.
I
I
was
was
I
so
was
shocked to hear
surprised.
people thought he was over the top in this. And it's like, no,
People
he's
don't like
great.
him in this.
Yeah, there's some people that
Really?
don't. I don't know. I don't know how many, but there are some people who think he, especially the courtroom scene, he like comes out of nowhere acting a bit more like high pitched or like, you
I don't
know,
know. Like you
I think
felt
it's
sort of
perfect
like
for the scene.
on key with John Lithgow, so you know.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
he comes in, he's very loud and like a force in the courtroom. Where I
Yeah,
thought like, isn't that what this character should be like?
yeah.
yeah. I feel like that's what we want.
Hmm. And I
This
do
is
like the scene when
interesting.
he's talking. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was just gonna say I like the scene where he's meeting with Leo one on one, which is fucking crazy that that was allowed to happen in real life. But they allowed that to happen, and so Brendan Fraser is like talking to him, and he's telling him like, "No, you like you understand they beat you and tortured you." And he's like, "No, they just made me stand up for a while." I was like, "No, you dumb boy. They beat and they tortured you." Like he's like,
Yeah.
"Get it through your head, you fucking idiot." And I don't know, like the way he acts that is quite good. I was impressed with him in this movie.
Well, that
John, you were
example
gonna
that
say
you
something.
mentioned there is interesting because, like, I'm actually I wanted to push back a little bit to say that I actually was a little off put by how sort of very emotional he was, like when he's like stood up. He's like, I can't
Mhm.
remember his line, but he's just like, "This is not acceptable" or something like that. Where
This
he's
man
just
is
like,
my client. He's been missing
yeah,
for a
yeah.
month. Yeah, that.
And
Yeah,
he does that very wide-eyed Brendan Fraser sort of thing where it's just like, I don't know, I feel like a lawyer would be a little more emotionally muted because like if like I think
Well,
lawyers tend to be that way where they try and not um they try not to emote too much. They try to understate
Oh,
their
I
feelings,
don't.
especially if they're in
um,
that
So I used
environment,
to
you know what
do
I
I
mean?
used to do a lot of, this is a little thing about, I used to do a lot of courtroom transcriptions for trial, uh, with trial attorneys arguing to courtrooms. I would hard disagree on emotional reservation by them. They are some very bombastic people because I think like most of the time they realize that the one who catches the attention of the jury and kind of sticks in their mind is the one who has a better chance of winning. So especially at like this era of
yeah.
American practice, this would have been like this felt very on, you know, par for the course to me for a defense attorney who's trying to win, you know, win over a jury who's already favorable to Robert De Niro's character. Yeah, the more outraged you can be in the defense of your client is definitely going to win you point. I mean, like look at Johnny Cochran in the OJ trial. Not to, you know, go back to that too many times, but he was way over the top a lot of the time, and he's the one who, you know, kind of dominated the courtroom with his presence. So
I think
No,
I think
I
too.
agree with that. I see what you're saying. I think it can depend on the lawyer. Like some people see the utility in having sort of an emotional bombast and using that to sort of gain sympathy and power in the courtroom. But I think
Yeah,
I've
acting
listened
like
to
a
other lawyers
preacher.
talk where
Yeah.
they think the emotional being reserved emotionally is the thing that gives you power in that sort of environment, right?
Yeah, I
Where
Oh
think
yeah,
you're
it can go
not
to your
either
sort of
point,
way.
unloading from both barrels, where you're just sort
I
of
think it can
a little
depend
bit
on the
muted.
strategy, right? Yeah,
Yeah,
Yeah.
like
yeah, it can
can
go
depend
either
on what
way.
you're going for, what your angle is in the case, whether it's better to play it quiet or play it loud,
Yeah, but like
But I definitely
if you're
think
gonna try to get something as unconventional, right? Because like even at the time, getting a lawyer to meet alone in a room with a prospective defendant who is currently a witness for the
for the
prosecution
prosecution, yeah,
that
holy
was
shit,
insanely irregular. It would
that's
not like should
insane.
not have been allowed. But if you're gonna try to like get that to happen, you're gonna act as outraged as possible, or the lawyer is gonna act as outraged as possible about like the circumstances that they're in, and to try to basically just be like, what the fuck, like how come I
Yeah.
haven't been allowed to consult with my client, why, like like, and essentially
He's
like if
been missing.
yeah, he's been missing for a month. This man is my client.
I mean, funnily
Yeah.
enough, in terms of deception, outrage is a good way to appear sincere. When
Yeah.
someone
Right.
That's
insinuates that
true.
you're acting in bad faith, you just get really mad about it. Like,
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
shows a
that's
lot
I
of
a very
agree.
fear.
good
Those are
point.
good points. And then like to another point that you made, Hugh, about like later on, like out of the courtroom where they're sort of meeting in that private room where he's saying like Leo's saying, well, they didn't beat me. And they're like, yes, they did. They
Yeah.
fucking abused you and tortured you. Like that actually works there, where he's getting
Yeah.
overly emotional, and Leo's just like, oh yeah, okay, they tortured me.
But
Yes,
I mean, it just
I
like,
agree.
especially with Ernest, who's kind of like especially around his family and around Hale, he's kind of a nervous wreck a lot of the time. Like
Mhm.
Right.
bullying him into submission like that with somebody as big
Yeah.
as Brendan Fraser. Like Brendan Fraser's a big guy, like he's a
Yeah.
pretty
True.
impressive, size. So somebody that size is like getting in your face and bellowing at you, like, no, this is what happened, and you're already sort of a ball of nerves. Like, whatever you
Yeah.
can do
And
to
he
diffuse
calls
that
him
situation.
and he calls him stupid, which there has been quite a bit of evidence scattered throughout the movie that like touches a nerve for him. I think, the very first scene with Hale, when he's talking about he's
Can
like,
you
"Are you
read?
a reader?" And he's like, I can read. No, I can read, sir." He's like really wants to make a point to him, like, "I can read. I'm not dumb. I'm a smart person." And then when Brendan Fraser's like, "No, you dumb boy, do this." It's like that touches a nerve with him. You know what I mean?
Mhm.
Yeah.
The other thing I was gonna say, no, don't lose it. Oh, I couldn't believe when I was watching this movie that they allowed the defense lawyer to meet one on one with the prosecutional witness. I was like, what the fuck? That was allowed to happen? That's insane, because that's like an automatic mistrial these days.
Yeah.
Like, you cannot do that.
Well,
Even
technically,
a
I
little
think it
bit.
should have been back then, but this is one of the things that the book kind of like the details of the court case get lost in the movie a little bit, probably because it's a little it's murkier, so it's harder to make it into a compelling narrative and to end
Well, the
the
big
movie, right?
thing, the big thing is that judge was more than likely bought out by Hale, right?
Yeah, that interaction happened, and that was allowed to happen in a county court in the Osage County, and the FBI was trying really hard to get it tried on a federal level, so that and I think I said this before too, but to make sure that Hale's money couldn't be spread around to the jurors or the witnesses or the judge or the prosecutors, and because it had to be like it had to go all the way up to the Supreme Court before it was finally allowed to be tried in federal jurisdiction. So it took a while. So for several months they were trying it in Oklahoma, and it was just like it was not going well. The jury was very much on, it was a very split decision, but they were being bribed and threatened, and the witnesses were being
Yeah.
bribed and threatened, and the judge was more than likely on the payroll. So when the main reason why this even happened was because of the federal government getting it into a federal court in
Yeah.
Washington or New York.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was just
Right.
gonna say that like that might have been a little like some of those corruption details might have been nice to see. Some of it was subtle in a way that I like being able to notice more things on a rewatch. For example, that one of the jurors in the trial is the guy who was in charge of Molly's money and who definitely knows what Hale is doing.
Yeah,
They don't make a
yeah.
point of it. They don't give him like a shot dedicated to showing that that's him, but he's just there. And if you're paying attention, you're like, oh fuck, he's on the jury. Like there's no
Right.
way he's gonna be, honest or
Impartial,
unbiased.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyone else have anything that we didn't talk about that you want to talk about? We covered
I
quite a
think-
bit of
yeah, I
the
think
movie
I'm-
film.
Pretty satisfied for the most part.
I'm glad that there wasn't any de-aging crap like there was in
Oh,
The
God,
Irishman.
yeah.
Oh,
Irishman.
Jesus, yeah.
I hated that in The Irishman. It was bad.
It didn't even
It was
work 'cause he
very
still
bad.
couldn't move like a younger man.
Yeah.
so-
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fuck. That's that one scene. The beat up in front of the
Pretty
grocery
bad.
store. Fuck.
Pretty
man.
bad.
Yeah.
Looks
And
like
I
he's doing
don't-
as much damage to himself as he is to the guy.
It's so true.
Yeah.
I'm not really over the fact that they cast Robert De Niro as the Irishman either. And maybe it's just because
It's not even the first time that he's done it, though. Like he plays Irish in Goodfellas as well. I'm
Yeah,
pretty
at
sure.
least in Goodfellas, the movie isn't named after the fact that he's Irish.
Yeah.
That always bugged me because then you look up what the guy looked like and you're like, yeah, no shit, that's the most Irish person I've ever seen in my life.
The regular.
Anyway,
yeah.
I do think that this is a step up from The Irishman, and in that
Yeah.
regard, it is one of his better films. Of recent.
There's a lot.
years.
There's a lot of good. There's a lot of good.
There's a lot of
and
good.
It's the movie's very interesting. A lot of great performances. A lot of great cinematography. The
Great
message.
music, great editing.
Yeah, great music, great editing. The message is strong, but could be handled better, I would say. And then like, there's just some annoying things, knowing some of the real history and knowing the adaptation was done sort of like seemingly with an agenda, for a particular kind of narrative.
Agenda
know.
might be a little harsh.
It's a little, yeah.
Um,
I'm inclined to
but-
agree with you. It's like there's certain things that were either omitted or changed directly to sort of push a particular narrative that just isn't true, or to sort of like give
Or it's
the
only
feel
half true.
of a narrative that's
Yeah.
only, yeah.
I'm willing to extend a lot of good faith in that regard, pretty much specifically because Ernest is made a much more not morally upstanding, but he's made more complicated than he perhaps is in reality.
I
Mm-hmm.
don't know.
That
I don't know. I think that was actually done relatively well.
No, what I mean by that is that him portraying Ernest in that way seems to run counter to the idea of cynically any cynicism in terms of messaging.
What I was trying to get at there is that the idea that this is sort of like an untold history that has been brushed under the rug and conspiratorially covered up kind of thing. That's the part really that gets on my nerves a little bit.
Yep. What I would mean is I'd put that down to honest not understanding, which isn't great, as opposed to perhaps a dishonest attempt to twist matters.
Yeah, I wouldn't call the movie dishonest. I think there's some sort of biases that Scorsese has towards the sort of
that's fair.
It could
dark
easily be being
villain.
too charitable, but
Yeah,
Well, that's
I
not
wouldn't
a
call
bad thing to be.
Yeah. It's his birthday, all right.
Yeah,
We'll give
you
him
know
a-
what?
Yeah,
You know what?
Happy
Happy birthday, Marty. I'll
It's his
Happy
birthday.
birthday, Marty.
birthday! You made a cool film.
Yeah, it was pretty cool. I think this last sort of thing to talk about for the movie before we go is sort of critical reception and especially awards season. Now, I think this is the biggest shoe-in for Best Picture that has ever been made ever. I don't know how anyone
Yeah,
else feels.
I don't know
or
how
cares
you
about that.
ignore it. Yeah, especially
I
at this moment, right? Like, what else
yeah.
has come out that could, you know, really compete?
Oh, it was driving me crazy. Some people are like, Barbie's definitely going to win Best Picture. I mean, you're out of your mind. You're out of your
What about
mind.
Oppenheimer?
Yeah.
Yeah, Oppenheimer's a strong contender,
Oh, yeah,
probably.
true. Oh, yeah.
Well,
Um,
I'm curious what you think exactly makes it a shoe-in specifically.
Okay, let's run down the list, shall we? For one, we have Martin Scorsese, a beloved film director who's been snubbed many years in the past, and so they'll feel like they owe him an award. There have been many such
Right.
cases of this over the years, where
Shape
they're
of
like,
Water
"Oh
is a
man,
good
we
one.
probably should have
Recently.
given this person an award already, but we'll give it to him for this one." I mean, I do think this, compared to a lot of the movies that will be nominated, this will probably be one of the stronger contenders anyway. But that's one reason. There's the Oscars love period pieces. The Oscars love really famous A-list actors like Leo and De Niro and all that sort of stuff. The Oscars love what we'll call important historical subject matter, especially in the cultural attitudes today. A lot of people will
The
call this
plight
an
of
important
marginalized
story.
people.
Yeah,
Right.
that needs to be told, and that sort of thing. That's definitely a point in its favor in terms of awards recognition.
Yep.
I do think, from a technical perspective, it's very, very well made. So there's nothing going to frustrate anyone about giving it Best Picture on those lines. Um, that's the gist of it.
Yeah.
That's why I think it's a shoe-in, and partially it's because I think if let's say its main competition is Oppenheimer, I think the importance of the subject matter in the eyes or the hearts of the Academy voters will give it the edge.
Right?
Yeah,
No,
that makes sense.
I agree with what you said there. And I like this more than Oppenheimer.
Oh,
So,
me too.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I like this more than Oppenheimer.
I do as well.
I
I
would
don't
be
know if that's a
happy
hot
if
take or
this
not, but
if this got the award, I don't think I'd be upset. Maybe I'm forgetting some other shit that came out this year, but I'd be happy
I
with
don't
this
think
winning
this
an
year's
award.
been especially strong for
No.
movies, to be honest. But
I'm sure.
maybe that's just me.
I'm sure Poor Things, when it comes out, is going to get some attention.
Oh, Napoleon will probably not be
Napoleon.
nominated unless it's really
yes.
bad.
Oh yeah.
I'm not especially looking forward to that movie, especially based on Ridley Scott's attitude towards historical accuracy and criticisms of that kind. Also, the trailer is just really cringe. There's no other way to put it. The war pigs shit, and it looks like visual sludge. I'm not excited for it.
Yeah.
I
Does
feel
not
like
look
Ridley's
good.
been slipping lately.
Lately.
yeah, really. What are we?
Yeah, or maybe for a long time. Yeah.
This man couldn't pick a good script if it slapped him in the dick. Like, he doesn't
Man,
know. He can't. He knows how to make a technically competent movie, but he does not understand storytelling. Not even a little bit. He can pick. It's like it's a 50-50 shot. It's a toss up if he's gonna pick a script that works or that's Prometheus. There's no.
The man made
Yeah.
two like genre-defining films, like Alien and Blade Runner, and then went on to try and ruin them, and then made nothing else since. Basically, like Jesus.
How do you feel about Gladiator?
I haven't actually seen Gladiator, so
It's been a
I
long
think that
time since I've seen Gladiator, but
think-
I remember enjoying it.
I like
I
Gladiator. I
think-
think it's good.
I think most people would probably put that as his last truly great movie, unless
Unless
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
some real big fans of The Martian out there.
maybe they're out. I'm sure they're out there. I'm sure that exists.
I was talking with a friend of mine recently about Ridley Scott, about like him and Denis Villeneuve were sharing a stage. They were talking about Blade Runner, and like Ridley Scott was talking about like, I think Deckard is a replicant, and Denis was like, hang on, like he pushed back on that, and he was just like, I think the ambiguity is sort of what makes that film strong, and I'm like, yeah, of course. Like, why the fuck wouldn't you think like that? So I initially thought like Ridley initially embraced the ambiguity and then later on decided he was a replicant. But then apparently Ridley always thought of Deckard as a replicant. But then there's the screenwriter of the original Blade Runner who was like thought firmly that he, I don't know, either he's not a replicant or it could go either way. And then that sort of contrast between the director and the screenwriter sort of made for a film that captured this sort of ambiguity that wouldn't have been possible otherwise. Like if you didn't have a director that like firmly believed one thing and a screenwriter that firmly believed the other thing. And I was just like, oh man, like why wouldn't Ridley fucking embrace the ambiguity of that script? I mean, surely the strength of it is that you don't know whether he's a robot or not. So like,
Yeah.
I was just
Speaking
like,
of ambiguous
I thought he
endings,
went.
In a way it
I thought
doesn't
he
matter.
started going to shit around Alien Covenant, where I was just like, this fucking. This is supposed to be a successor to Alien. Like, come on, man. Like,
yeah.
anyway,
Speaking of
So that was
ambiguous endings,
I was going to say
Hold
Alien
on.
Covenant was 3 years after Exodus: Gods and Kings. So,
did Ridley Scott do that?
oh yeah.
Holy fuck! I didn't know that.
yeah, he's had some duds. But speaking
That
of
was
ambiguous
terrible,
endings,
wasn't it?
It's really bad. Yeah,
it was. Ben Allen in the chat says Thelma and Louise is my favorite Ridley Scott movie, and there's a good ambiguous ending. Like, did they live or did the car fly away into heaven? Who knows? Kind of ambiguous, and that's what makes it so powerful.
I forgot that was him too. Man, I like that movie too. I forgot he directed that.
It's fun. It's at least somewhat enjoyable.
Yeah.
Well, unless there's anything else, I think we will end here. Thank you all so very much for joining us in the chat and for the super chats. We really appreciate it.
as always.
Yeah, and thanks to our wonderful guests for joining us for this discussion. Thanks,
for
guys.
having me on.
Hey,
been-
thanks
yeah,
for
it's been
having me,
fun.
man.
Always well.
Yeah, well, we're gonna try to do this more and more, and the sort of our MO. I don't know if we might get to weekly streams eventually, but for now, our MO will be to do this sort of thing and talk about the movies that EFAP's too scared to talk about. So yeah, so if you're like, oh, they're too scared to talk about real movies, come check out us
They're
instead.
not cinema.
Yeah. Well, on that note, we'll say goodbye. Thank you all again for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of the year. We'll probably do another stream before the year's out. We might do like a best and worst of the year type thing, or unless there's a movie that comes out like Napoleon or Poor Things that is really worth talking about, we'll do that. And Devs episode 4 will come out eventually. I promise, I swear, for real. So goodbye, friends. Goodbye.
Bye, chat.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks a lot, guys.